Russell, he took a shine to me right away. After a while, he started giving me little things to do. But then Angelo himself, he started to give me little things to do too. Russ's wife, Carrie, her family goes all the way back, way back to the same town in Sicily as the Buffalinos. They talked about it all the time. She came from mob royalty, if you want to call it that. The Chiandras. To them, it was like they came over on the Italian Mayflower.
Throughout the long, violent arc of organized crime in America, there were always conventions. Secret summits where the nation's most dangerous men met to map out the future. But by the time the 1940s rolled around, the old order was collapsing. The men who once ran the underworld like emperors, those who stood shoulder to shoulder at the Atlantic City Conference in the late 20s, were either dead, locked up, or marked for execution. That roster of ghosts included some of the biggest names the American mob had ever known. There was King Solomon of Boston, murdered in 1933. John Lazier, gunned down in 1934. Both had stood at Atlantic City, sipping champagne on the boardwalk while planning the future of crime in America. But their future came fast and hard. Legs Diamond, Dutch Schultz, Bo Weinberg, Louis Pretty Amberg, all gone. Some were killed by their own, others were taken out by rivals or the law. All of them had once held power in the palm of their hand. The old bootleggers were either pivoting or falling. If you made a mistake, even a small one, it could cost you. Taxmen were on the prowl. Tom Dewey's prosecutors were building cases like hammers looking for nails. Fiorello LaGuardia wanted headlines and wasn't shy about shaking the underworld tree to get them. It was the wrong time to attract attention. And Carlo Gambino, usually the quietest man in the room, became the one who slipped. In 1937, Gambino was arrested, his only major bust, and it hit like thunder. The scheme wasn't small time. It wasn't even subtle. Gambino had adapted. Prohibition might have ended, but liquor was still profitable, especially if you sold it without the taxes. He had the routes, the connections, the distilleries. He was using old Sicilian ties to plug into Pennsylvania syndicates and build a new network. Instead of smuggling booze from Canada, he was tapping into tank cars full of grain alcohol and swapping the contents before the government could count its cut. June 15th, 1937. Federal agents raided a freight siding in Port Richmond, Philadelphia. They found an 8,000-gallon tank car from the Publica alcohol plant. Inside, men were caught in the act, pumping pure alcohol into drums and replacing it with denatured fluid. The agents had been watching. 14 of them swooped in. The plan was to divert 24,000 gallons per month, costing the U.S. Treasury over $30,000 in taxes for just that one load. On the street, that alcohol was worth $56,000. Carlo Gambino was arrested on the spot. He had $2,600 in cash in his pocket when they cuffed him. He wasn't alone. Among the arrested were Rosario Calcasola, Morris Jenkins, William Urofsky, Edward Brennan, Salvatore Guglianini, and Gertus Rosborough. Agents said the Publica employees were in on it. So were railroad yard workers. Even a yardmaster at Port Richmond, Philetus Smith, the brother of the warden of Eastern State Penitentiary, was implicated. But this wasn't just a Philadelphia operation. A month later, the scope of the enterprise exploded. On July 15th, a federal grand jury in Brooklyn handed down a sweeping indictment. 42 defendants, including 10 Brooklynites, a woman, and 6 corporations, were charged with operating the largest bootlegging ring in the country. The indictment alleged the crew redistilled and sold over 113,000 gallons of denatured alcohol, defrauding the government of over $300,000 in liquor taxes. Carlo Gambino's name was right there on the front page. He and his associates were charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, possession of untaxed alcohol, and transportation of illegal liquor. The operation stretched from Brooklyn to Manhattan, Staten Island, to upstate New York, New Jersey, and into Maryland. Their alcohol was stored in hidden warehouses, then distributed in small lots to stills across the region. One seizure alone, August 24, 1936, in a Brooklyn garage, turned up 650 gallons of cleaned alcohol. Federal prosecutors called the case the largest bootlegging conspiracy in America. In court, it was said some of the alcohol was so poorly reprocessed, it remained poisonous. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Saver led the charge, citing wiretap evidence and surveillance records. Gambino's lawyer fought hard, but the case moved forward. On May 19, 1939, the gavel came down in U.S. District Court in Philadelphia. The feds had nailed 11 men and one Brooklyn corporation for conspiring to defraud the government of liquor taxes. Sentences ranged from 1 day to 22 months. Gambino took the hardest hit of them all, 22 months in federal prison and a $2,500 fine, the stiffest sentence handed out. Others sentenced alongside him included Peter Pillon of Fairview, New Jersey, 15 months and a $1,500 fine. William Urosky of Philadelphia, 13 months and $500. Salvatore Guglielmini, also of Brooklyn, 8 months and $250. Abe Meyerov of Philadelphia, 6 months and $50. The A.R. Hauser Company, a varnish manufacturer out of Brooklyn, was fined $250. The case had originally included 22 men and the corporation. 2 were acquitted. 1 had died. Another was ruled mentally unfit, and 1 received a severance. Sentences for 5 others were delayed or suspended. But it was Gambino, quiet and calculating, who absorbed the full blow. Still, fate had one more twist. Just 8 months later, the case imploded. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that evidence obtained through wiretaps was inadmissible. The government admitted its entire case hinged on electronic surveillance. With the evidence tossed, so was the conviction. Carlo Gambino walked free. 3 weeks later, the feds tried again, bringing a new indictment out of Brooklyn, accusing Gambino and 9 others of defrauding the government out of $3 million in a separate liquor tax scheme. And still, the biggest consequence Carlo faced in that case was a 30-day jail sentence. He would never serve serious time again. For a man who would go on to run the most powerful mafia family in America, this was the only time they got close. And even then, he slipped out the back door cool, silent, untouchable. It was his first and last real mistake. And then there was the brutal Panto murder, a killing that would come back like a ghost to haunt Albert Anastasia and the Mafia itself. That one murder would live in the shadows for years, only to resurface in the 1950s when Anastasia, already cracking under pressure, spiraled into paranoia. He started ordering hits like a mad king, anyone, anytime, no reason needed. The blood he spilled in the past came back to collect. In the end, it wasn't his enemies that brought him down. It was his own past catching up with him, with Luciano behind bars. One by one, the old guard faded. Another was Abe, Kid Twist, Reles, a canary who could sing but never fly. He had once been Frank Costello's driver. He knew everything. The Anastasia rackets, the cold precision of murder incorporated. He was the last breath of a dying era. As the old kings fell, a new era crept in. Capone was long gone, rotting behind bars. The Chicago outfit was changing leadership. In New Orleans, Silver Dollar Sam was under the microscope, facing growing scrutiny as he aged out of power. His successor, Carlos Marcello, was stepping into his twilight years. A shift was underway. By the mid-1940s, a new generation was rising. Some had old blood in their veins. Others were fresh faces with modern instincts. But together, they would dominate the 1950s and take organized crime to a level the old bosses never imagined. With Luis Lepke Buchalter behind bars, Carlo Gambino sat in silence, stunned. He understood exactly what had just happened. Albert Anastasia, his brother-in-arms, his wartime partner in murder, had handed over a man they once fought beside. Lepke wasn't just a business associate. He was a friend. They had buried bodies together. Gambino had seen them shoulder to shoulder in the trenches of the underworld. Anastasia had even hidden Lepke when he went on the run. He lobbied Luciano himself to provide shelter and protection. But all that loyalty, all that blood and history, meant nothing when the moment came. Gambino watched, cold and quiet, as Anastasia personally walked Lepke into the hands of Hoover. Walter Winchell wrote about it, not the betrayal, not the dark poetry of mob brotherhood broken, but the legend of Hoover, glorified and mythologized in the morning papers. And that, right there, was the birth of something new. An unholy communion between organized crime and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Before that, it had been one thing to pay off a beat cop, a judge, maybe a city commissioner. But this was different. This was the federal government. This was J. Edgar Hoover. Gambino began to understand the power structure for what it really was. He learned the quiet secrets behind Hoover's polished public image, his sexual orientation, long whispered about in the corridors of Washington. And more importantly, Gambino learned that everyone in power already knew. They tolerated it because Hoover was untouchable. He was the king of blackmail. Everyone had something to hide. Politicians, socialites, senators, even mob bosses. And Gambino realized that to survive, to rise, he had to operate in that world. The world of secrets, leverage, and silence. New York, he believed, was full of hypocrites. And, in the Sicilian code, hypocrites were worse than rats. Hoover, from that moment on, developed a quiet understanding with Frank Costello. Costello figured out the rules. No crimes across state lines. Keep the feds out. If you moved gambling equipment, don't cross borders. So, when he expanded into Louisiana, he built new warehouses, new casinos, roulette wheels, blackjack tables and slot machines, all local. He taught others how to do the same. Want to move women for prostitution across states? Don't call it prostitution. Make it a union. Give the girls job titles, dancers, entertainers. Then set up sister unions in other cities, New York, Miami, and New Orleans. You could move a national network of women coast to coast under the protection of labor law. The man who perfected this system was Carlos Marcello, the quiet boss of New Orleans. In that city, prostitution was practically tradition, dating back to the French colonial days. The French Corsican mob had already laid the foundation. After the Second World War, Europe was rubble, full of desperate women, easy targets for smooth promises, and one-way tickets to America. They were told they'd be stars. Instead, they were trafficked, funneled through ports, and put to work under Marcello's empire. Keeping the FBI off your back was survival, but keeping the FBI in your pocket, that was power. Hollywood played its role too. The mob helped greenlight films that painted Hoover as a saint, the G-men as American knights. But in reality, Hoover was sitting in racetracks with Costello, sharing tips in private gambling booths, dining with him in Manhattan restaurants, even meeting face-to-face in private parks. By now, the Mafia had learned how to play Washington like a fiddle. Every agency had its pressure points. If they wanted headlines, the mob gave them headlines. If they needed good press, the mob served it up. And when they needed to make a show, some arrests, some raids, the mob made sure the right heads were offered up. Sacrifices were part of the game. And Gambino understood all of it. One day he'd have to offer up sacrifices of his own, to protect the empire, to keep the courts quiet, to help a district attorney get re-elected. If that meant giving up one of his own, then so be it. Carlo Gambino had come to understand something critical. If you wanted to thrive in the American underworld, you couldn't do it alone. Ethnic lines blurred when money was on the table. He saw the need and the opportunity to forge ties with Jewish organized crime. So, he did what any smart mobster would do. He started building relationships, earning trust, sending his own men in to work with theirs. It wasn't just about protection. It was about mutual benefit. Gambino didn't just want to coexist. He wanted a piece of their operations. That included the lucrative rackets in New Jersey, run by one of the East Coast's most powerful Jewish mobsters, Abner Longy Zwilman. During the Great Depression, Longy Zwilman wasn't just making money. He was bailing out entire industries. Alongside his Philadelphia counterpart, the formidable Nig Rosen, another ally of Meyer Lansky, they controlled the loan sharking and protection rackets across both Philadelphia and New Jersey. They weren't nickel and dime hoods shaking down corner stores. These men were bankrolling oil, coal, and steel companies, the beating heart of Pennsylvania's economy. Fortune 500 firms were silently dependent on the underworld to stay afloat. And Franklin Roosevelt, now in the White House, was about to inject massive federal dollars into these same industries, building them up for a looming war effort. Organized crime wasn't just surviving the Depression, it was entrenching itself in America's future. Back during Prohibition, Newark, just a short haul from Manhattan, had become the bootleg capital of the eastern seaboard. And at the center of it all was Zwilman. He wasn't just another gangster. He was the gangster, the muscle, the brains, the politician in a silk suit. Between 1926 and 1931, his crew pulled in an estimated $50 million from bootlegging alone. At their peak, they controlled 40% of all liquor smuggled into the United States. That kind of power doesn't stay in the shadows. Zwilman became the de facto Democratic boss of Newark's Third Ward. He had politicians in his pocket, judges on speed dial. His influence reached as high as the governor's office. The old rumor was that any man running for governor who took Zwilman's money had to give him one thing in return: the right to handpick the new attorney general. It was never proven. But oddly enough, mobsters didn't seem to have many legal problems in New Jersey. Still, no underworld kingdom lasts without challengers. Zwilman's rise was matched by another man's ascent, Ruggiero Richie the Boot Boiardo. While Longy controlled the Third Ward, Richie laid claim to the first. And the two couldn't have been more different. Zwilman, the polished mobster, married into high society, gave generously to the poor, and wore his philanthropy like a badge of honor. But when it came to power, he played for keeps. Boiardo, on the other hand, was flash and fury. He wore a $5,000 belt buckle encrusted with diamonds. He liked being seen. But in 1930, the two men shocked everyone when they announced they had buried the hatchet. To prove it, they threw a celebration, a 2-day blowout that became legendary in Newark. Politicians and gangsters rubbed shoulders. The booze never stopped. Among the guests was a former U.S. commissioner, a state assembly candidate, and Paul Moore, a Democrat running for Congress. Moore made a critical mistake. He took a photo with Richie the Boot and his glittering belt buckle. His opponent, Fred Hartley, had thousands of copies of the photo printed and distributed across the 8th District. Moore later blamed that picture for his defeat. And if Richie thought the party had made him and Zwilman true friends, he was sorely mistaken. Not long after the bash, Boiardo stepped outside a building on Broad Street and walked straight into a sniper's trap. Bullets tore through the air from across the street. It was a message, loud and clear. Longy Zwilman didn't share power. Not for long. By the early 1940s, the criminal landscape of New York had shifted. The wild days of bootlegging and Tommy guns were fading, and a new generation of mobsters, quieter, more political, was taking the reins. At the center of it all was a man the public barely knew, a short, stocky figure with a mangled hand and a surgical understanding of how power flowed in the city. His name was Thomas Lucchese, though most in the life called him ThreeFinger Brown. He had risen from auto theft to murder suspect to garment district racketeer without ever making headlines. But by the time the war effort was reshaping American industry, Lucchese had become something else entirely. The quiet bridge between the mob and the political machine. To the public, he was a legitimate businessman. To the underworld, he was the new power in Manhattan, Frank Costello's heir apparent, whispering to both congressmen and killers with equal ease. Costello himself, facing growing heat from the feds, had taken a step back. Lucchese stepped forward. Behind closed doors, his real power was built not in alleys or gambling dens, but in the smoky banquet halls of New York's elite. His name was on invitation lists. Judges, magistrates, city officials, even congressmen and federal agents broke bread with him. They didn't just tolerate him, they visited his home. Government vehicles with official plates parked outside his house on weekends. They came to him, and yet behind the smile, his fingers were still in everything, from union muscle to narcotics pipelines. His name turned up on slips of paper found in the pockets of dope peddlers, couriers, and smugglers all the way from Manhattan to Italy. One document, pulled from Lucky Luciano's coat during a sweep in Naples, listed Tommy Brown alongside names like Willie Moretti, Joseph Biondo, Trigger Mike Coppola, and Joseph Profaci. These weren't dinner guests. They were the shadow cabinet of American organized crime. Lucchese's public record on paper looked light, but the shadows told a different story. He'd been pulled in for murder more than once. Back in 1928, he'd been picked up in connection to the Cerasulo shooting. 3 bullets, 1 dead man. No indictment. Then again in 1930, his partner, Joseph Pinzolo, was gunned down in their shared office dispute tied to the wine brick business, a Prohibition-era loophole used to ferment alcohol on the sly. Lucchese vanished for 3 days before showing up at the district attorney's office with his lawyer, Francis X. Mancuso, a former Tammany judge who later partnered with him in real estate. Once again, no indictment. Even Maranzano's assassination in 1931, executed inside an office at 230 Park Avenue, bore the faint fingerprint of Lucchese. He was there, in the waiting room, gave the police a blank stare, and said he saw nothing. Just another bystander. Over and over again, Tommy walked freely. By the early 1940s, Jimmy Hines, the Tammany powerhouse, who once sold protection to Dutch Schultz, was giving Lucchese a piece of Midtown, a piece of the garment district, union-controlled and profit-heavy. Lucchese held it like a man born to grip. But that brought problems too. Louis Lepke Buchalter, the architect of Murder Incorporated, called a sit-down. He wanted no encroachment. He laid down the law. Reles would later tell prosecutors that Lepke warned Tommy to back off. Lepke was on the run, but even in hiding, he knew ThreeFinger Brown was a threat. What no one saw coming was how Tommy would pivot, not through bullets, but through ballots. By the mid-1940s, Lucchese had made himself a friend of politicians. Real politicians. Records would later show he contributed $2,000 to William O'Dwyer's 1949 campaign fund, a gift made in January 1950, long after the victory. A thank you, late but deliberate. His reach wasn't limited to city politics. Federal agents, quietly watching, began to realize he was moving in those circles too. Some even suspected Lucchese was building the narcotics networks Luciano had left behind after his deportation in 1946. Names kept overlapping. Phone calls from Lucchese's house to Costello's, to Moretti's, to men in Los Angeles, Chicago, Havana, and Palermo. By the mid-1940s, Tommy Lucchese wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was something more elusive, an operator, a figure who understood that the real game wasn't just being played in the streets, but in courtrooms, campaign headquarters, and banquet halls. His grip on the underworld of Manhattan was growing, and he didn't need to raise his voice or flash a gun. He had people for that. What Tommy was doing now was different. He was infiltrating the halls of justice. Lucchese had a man on the inside, Armand Chankalian, a name that barely registered in the public eye, but in the corridors of Foley Square, he ran the show. Officially, he was just an administrative assistant to U.S. Attorney Miles Lane, earning just over $9,000 a year. But unofficially, Armand was the gatekeeper. He managed the courthouse building, controlled access to stenographers and confidential case files, and wielded subtle influence in every hallway from the U.S. Attorney's office to the judge's chambers. And he loved his job too much to take a vacation. At least that's what he told anyone who asked. But behind the clean paper trail, Chankalian was doing something far more valuable for Lucchese. He was acting as a social sponsor, a fixer. A man who introduced ThreeFinger Brown to the kind of people who could protect him. Not just street cops and union reps, but judges, prosecutors, and federal investigators. They dined together at the Alfred Smith Memorial dinners, mingled at functions hosted by the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, and made casual introductions, where a handshake could shift the weight of a criminal indictment. To those who didn't know any better, Lucchese passed for a well-dressed garment manufacturer. Few connected him to narcotics traffic, union violence, or the blood in the garment district. But the illusion cracked in New Jersey. Chankalian, sent to Newark on a government assignment, tried to introduce Lucchese to a federal judge. "Just a friend," he said, but the judge recognized the name. "Isn't he the notorious gangster known as ThreeFinger Brown?" Lucchese was standing nearby. He heard it. He opened his arms and shrugged. "Oh, that story. I made a little mistake once, and my family's been suffering ever since." The judge walked away in silence. Days later, Chankalian pushed again, suggesting Lucchese wanted to discuss a pending case. The judge exploded, "Get that man the hell out of this building." It was a rare rejection, the kind Chankalian never faced in his own domain. Back in New York, things still worked differently. Investigators would later find phone records, hotel bills, and shared vacations that painted a clearer picture of their connection. At the Hotel Astor, Chankalian lived comfortably in a two-room suite, paying over $3,000 a year, long before his salary could justify it. Hotel logs showed that in March 1948, Lucchese booked rooms 300 and 302, using a Washington alias, and the bill, $25 and change, was quietly transferred to Chankalian's account. The same year, from January to February, Lucchese and Chankalian were spotted in Miami Beach with a New York City councilman. When asked, Chankalian said it was a coincidence. "We just happened to be at the same hotel," he claimed. Crime Commission investigators weren't convinced. They photostatted the hotel records. Back in Foley Square, when reporters tried to press him about the relationship, Chankalian replied with a smirk, "It's a rule of this office not to discuss persons or subjects of a controversial nature." Behind closed doors, the wheels kept turning. In 1949, Lucchese had allegedly attended a mob summit at Duke's restaurant in West New York. According to Republican challenger Edward Corsi, the meeting included Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. The purpose? Backing a new candidate for mayor. Costello and Genovese threw their weight behind Ferdinand Pecora, the Tammany man. Lucchese backed Vincent Impellitteri. When O'Dwyer changed his mind and re-entered the race, the syndicate shifted support. But the moment O'Dwyer resigned to take the ambassadorship in Mexico, the alliances split again, each boss returning to their original horse. Corsi called Lucchese the smartest of them all. He hides behind a legitimate cloak and suit business, but behind that, he's reaching for control of the entire New York underworld. It was a new kind of gangster, a quiet man in tailored suits, slipping from business meeting to courtroom, never seen with a weapon, never heard issuing orders. But the result was always the same. Judges shook his hand, prosecutors smiled at him, and politicians listened. By the late 1940s, Tommy Lucchese had accomplished what few men in his world could. He moved freely between the underworld and the upper class. With his crooked hand tucked in his jacket and a tailored suit on his back, he no longer looked like a man with a rap sheet or a trigger crew. He looked like a garment tycoon, a civic leader. His past, stolen cars, murder charges, mob meetings, was hidden behind a curtain of political connections and social dinners. Even the men charged with fighting crime didn't seem to see it. One of those men was Thomas Murphy. Murphy had made his name taking down Soviet spies in the Alger Hiss case. By the end of the decade, he was on his way to becoming New York City Police Commissioner and then a federal judge. But somewhere along the way, before the robes and the headlines, he met ThreeFinger Brown, and he didn't flinch. In a letter dated June 25, 1951, Murphy admitted to having known Lucchese for 6 years. The letter was written to Senator Alexander Wiley, who was reviewing Murphy's nomination to the federal bench. The recommendation went through without a hitch. But the shadow it left behind never quite disappeared. Murphy said he had no idea Lucchese was a gangster, that he believed him to be a reputable businessman, a dress manufacturer, that he'd seen him in the company of respected people, even other judges and city officials. In fact, it wasn't until late 1950, when Murphy was preparing dossiers for the Department of Justice, that he stumbled on a New York Police Department slip. It listed Lucchese's past. 1921 conviction for auto theft, 3 years in Sing Sing. 1927 arrest for receiving stolen goods, dismissed. 1928 and 1930 murder arrests, dismissed. 1935 vagrancy charge, dismissed. Murphy chalked the dismissals up to the NYPD's old tactic of rounding up known criminals after any major hit, whether or not they were involved. But the deeper truth was harder to ignore. Murphy had invited Lucchese to his own home, twice. Lucchese had returned the gesture. They dined together, sat side by side at banquets like the friendly sons of St. Patrick. The 1949 seating list read like a roll call of respectability. Judges, lawyers, politicians, and right there, tucked among them, was Thomas Lucchese. Murphy believed the introduction had come through Armand Chankalian, the courthouse gatekeeper and fixer. Chankalian, who had taken it upon himself to bring Lucchese into the orbit of federal law enforcement, had done more than open doors. He had blurred the line between courtroom and backroom. Even after learning the truth, Murphy seemed conflicted. He said Lucchese impressed him as a man who'd paid his debt, who wanted a clean life for his family. He claimed he'd only spoken to him once since uncovering his record. And even then, Lucchese had offered helpful information that Murphy used during his early days as commissioner, trying to clean up the department from the Harry Gross bookie scandal. Still, the connections were impossible to untangle. Lucchese's name kept turning up next to men like Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Joey Rao, Trigger Mike Coppola, and Tony Bender Strollo, names whispered across the 5 boroughs whenever someone turned up dead or vanished with a trail of numbers scrawled in their pockets. Worse still was the implication that Mayor Vincent Impellitteri, Murphy's political patron, had also been close to Lucchese. Ed Corsi, the Republican candidate in 1950, claimed Lucchese had been behind Impelliteri's rise to the city council presidency in 1945. That mob bosses met in West New York, New Jersey, at Duke's restaurant to divide their support for candidates. Costello, Genovese, and Adonis allegedly backed Ferdinand Pecora. Lucchese pushed impellitteri. The mayor denied it all. Through friends and aides, Impellitteri said he hadn't even met Lucchese until 1946, and only at public events. That he never dined with him privately. That the idea Lucchese was behind his political rise was incredible. But the evidence told another story. Lucchese had clout. He didn't just have friends in politics, he had people making excuses for him in the highest corridors of government. When asked how someone like him could end up at the top of the city's power structure, the mayor's team pointed to how thin his own campaign coffers were. If gangsters backed him, one supporter asked, why did he only have $134 in the campaign fund? It was a deflection, not an answer. In the end, the truth was that Lucchese had built something few others had. A hybrid empire. Part criminal, part civic, part legitimate business. In the clubs, in the courthouses, in the cloakrooms of City Hall, he moved like a man untouchable. Not because he was feared, but because he was accepted. By 1950, Tommy Lucchese was no longer just a power behind the throne. He was becoming the throne itself. He had outlived most of his rivals. Costello was in jail. Luciano was in exile. Moretti had been silenced with bullets. And the press, the politicians, and the public had begun whispering the question out loud. Who is really in charge now? The answer was a quiet little man with a mangled hand, a sharp suit, and a certificate of good conduct, signed by the New York State Parole Board. A man who was once busted for auto theft in 1921, and now dined with judges and owned more properties than he could walk across in a day. But that certificate, granted in April 1950, wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the final polish on an identity makeover that had been years in the making. What the board didn't know, or maybe didn't want to know, was that Lucchese had already voted illegally in Queens during the 1944 presidential election. He signed a form claiming to be a lifelong New Yorker, conveniently skipping over the 6 years he spent living across the river in New Jersey. That alone should have voided the application. But in Lucchese's world, when a door was locked, someone always had a key. That someone was Armand Chankalian. The federal courthouse fixer, still at his post under U.S. Attorney Miles Lane, was allegedly writing letters on Lucchese's behalf, even volunteering to speak to the board personally. When reporters later asked to see who vouched for Lucchese, those names were missing from the file. Erased. The files were as empty as a cleared crime scene. This wasn't the first time Tommy had rewritten his past. In 1936, when he applied for U.S. citizenship, he admitted the one conviction that sent him to Sing Sing, but left off 4 other arrests, including 2 for homicide. On paper, he looked like a man with a youthful mistake. In reality, he'd walked through more police lineups than a Manhattan booking sergeant, and yet his path to respectability never slowed. On March 31, 1941, federal narcotics agents stormed Duke's restaurant in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, long known as a gangster resort and good food spot. Inside, they found 80 men, including Lucchese, Willie Moretti, Solly Moretti, and a convicted drug trafficker named Salvatore Archidiaco. Lucchese told agents he was just stopping in for a cup of coffee. He was let go. Nothing stuck. Again. But this was more than a game of cops and gangsters. Tommy Lucchese had become a master at blurring the lines between legitimate business, political influence, and criminal muscle. He wasn't a thug anymore. He was a $1 million manufacturer, secretary-treasurer of Braunell Limited, a garment firm pulling in more than $1 million a year. He paid taxes, $70,000 between 1942 and 1951. His name was on the ledger, but so was that of Joseph Logano, a vice president with a narcotics conviction. The money was real, but so were the shadows behind it. He still dabbled too. Years earlier, he backed the Casino de Paris, a midtown joint with Billy Rose producing and Benny Goodman on stage. But when the mob started pushing rats through dance floors to sabotage competitors, Rose walked. To this day, he claimed they still owed him $16,000. Not every venture paid off. Lucchese allegedly lost heavy when Prohibition ended, along with his syndicate's attempt to sell King's Brewery for $8.5 million to Jacob Ruppert. They held out. The deal died, and so did their profits. But Tommy adapted. He always did. He turned his sights toward property, construction, hoisting equipment, window cleaning, and real estate. He moved into garment labor rackets, and people whispered that he now held more power in the garment district than Lepke Buchalter ever had. The same Lepke who went to the chair while Lucchese took over his union routes. And yet, no matter how high he climbed, Lucchese was still Tommy Brown to his friends, the same kid who lost his finger in a munitions accident back during World War I, the same guy who paid in cash and never talked business on the phone. He lived with quiet elegance in a $60,000 ranch home in Lido Beach, with 10 surrounding lots and a view of the shore. He built the house with workers from a nearby project, slipping them cash in envelopes every week. He also kept a year-round place in Malba, Queens, and once lived in Palisades, New Jersey. And people liked him. He was charming, low-key, and always willing to help. A neighbor fell sick. The doctors said the Mayo Clinic could save him, but there was a 3-month wait. Lucchese made a call, said, "That's ridiculous," and within an hour, the neighbor had an appointment for the next day. He never found out who Rosie was on the other end of that line. By the time the State Crime Commission came calling, Lucchese had already spoken for 500 pages worth of testimony. He denied every name, every tie. If they could prove he lied, perjury was on the table. But even Rudolph Halley, the Senate Crime Committee's former counsel, admitted the committee never had the manpower to go after Lucchese like they did Costello. He just didn't leave fingerprints behind. Halley still believed he had replaced Costello as Manhattan's crime viceroy. He turned over a thick file to the state. Whether it would stick was another matter. Because Tommy Lucchese, the man the world knew as ThreeFinger Brown, had pulled off something rare, he had disappeared in plain sight. "How's your friend doing lately?" Lansky asked, his voice low, almost casual, but there was weight behind the question. Lucchese raised an eyebrow. "What friend?" "You know the one," Lansky said with a hint of a smirk. "Your little protégé." Tommy chuckled. "Which protégé?" "I've been keeping Luciano updated," Lansky said, leaning in slightly. "Telling him who's earning, how they're earning, and what's moving where. He's not sitting idle in there, Tommy. You can see it in his eyes. Just talking about the rackets, about getting back on the streets. His mouth practically waters. He's hungry, really hungry, and he's got plans." Lucchese tilted his head. "Plans?" "You should talk to Costello," Lansky continued. "Charlie's been really reading. History, strategy, Sicilian bloodlines, political maneuvering. The man's sharpening his mind. He's not rotting in that cell, he's studying the game." Lucchese gave a small nod. "If you're talking about my little prodigy," he said, "Luciano's got his eye on him." "He likes him," Lansky confirmed. "Especially the ration stamp angle. Says it's clever, low risk, high reward." Tommy leaned back, thoughtful. "And Anastasia?" Maya's smile faded. "Charlie's not thrilled. He's been sitting in prison for years, watching the rest of them live free. Happy, well-fed and careless. He gave them the keys to the kingdom, and now they're risking it all, like amateurs." Lucchese gave a knowing look. "The murders?" "Exactly," Lansky said. "Peter Pan too. That diamond hit. It's reckless. Bad press, bad timing, bad for business. Charlie wanted them to keep their heads down, but they're out there making noise. Well, we've got to move past it, Lansky said. Eyes on the prize. The priority is getting Luciano out. That's the mission. Everything else is noise. Lucchese nodded slowly, his voice low but firm. To do that, we need leverage, political, financial. We lock down New York, tight. I'm not talking just unions or street-level rackets. I'm talking the infrastructure, the docks, the ports, the companies behind them. Every pier, every warehouse, every freight line. We don't shake 'em down. We buy in. He leaned forward, tapping ash off his cigarette. Start with Brooklyn, the Navy Yard, 6 dry docks, 10 berths. They called it the can-do shipyard during the war. You control that. You control military supply routes, ship repairs, defense contracts. That's more than money. That's federal attention. That's power. Then you've got the New York Dock Company, all up and down the Brooklyn waterfront. Martins, Robinson, Roberts, Governors, Red Hook, Woodruff, Clinton, Union, Prentice. Piers and warehouses that handle everything from textiles to steel shipments. That's where our guys need to be. On the inside. On payrolls. On boards. Silent partners. He glanced toward Lansky. Manhattan, too. The West Side piers along the Hudson. Those are run by the city's Department of Docks. Passenger liners, cargo ships, international freight. West, 34th, 42nd, 56th. They're all active. You control who offloads what, who gets priority, who pays a little extra to move product without questions. Lansky didn't interrupt. He let Tommy lay it out. And it doesn't stop with New York, Lucchese continued. We expand. The port of Houston, deep water, growing fast, oil, steel, military freight. The port blew up in the 40s and it ain't slowing down. We get in early. We own part of that boom. He rattled them off like territory markers. Galveston, old port, steady movement of goods and troops during the war. Philadelphia Naval Yard, oldest in the country, been outfitting and repairing ships since Roosevelt's grandfather was in office. And Erie, up by the lake. Quiet but important. Regional shipping hub. Steel, timber, even passengers. Nobody's watching it, which makes it perfect. Lucchese leaned back, eyes narrowed. This ain't about nickel and dime hijackings. It's national. If we want to get Charlie out, if we want to build something that lasts, we control the arteries, the docks, the unions, the warehouses, the trucking, the oil fields, from Pennsylvania coal to Texas crude. And to do that, we need the government angles locked in, politicians, port authorities, union leaders, judges, commissioners. He let it hang for a moment, then looked directly at Lansky. Otherwise, it's all smoke. Lansky lowered his tone, even, deliberate. What about Frank Costello? He asked. Isn't he the one who's supposed to have all the politicians on lock? Tommy shrugged. Frank needs votes, Maya. Politicians don't just move because you shake their hand or slip them an envelope. They need numbers, boots on the ground, precincts controlled, districts delivered. He needs help getting those crucial elections across the line. That's where we come in. Lansky nodded slowly, processing every word. If we can put politicians at the same table the way we're sitting now, Lucchese continued, that's something bigger than what any of them dreamed of. Forget ideology. This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. This is about profit, influence, control. These politicians, they're hungry. They want power, legacy, and leverage. So we give it to them, and in return they give it right back. Maya lit a cigarette and leaned forward. It's time we start building our own political hierarchy, he said. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Harlem, New Orleans, Chicago, Pittston, Philadelphia, Jersey. We back their candidates until they back ours, and then we back an entire party, a presidential campaign, the whole machine. He exhaled slowly. It's got to be automated, structured, no more guesswork. We need to start communicating across the country, like a corporation. Because if we get that right, no Tom Dewey, no LaGuardia, no Roosevelt is ever going to come near us again. We'll be untouchable. Lucchese nodded. FDR's getting older. He's not going to be around forever. Do we need to think ahead? Who's next? Who do we want sitting in that chair when the time comes? Lansky took another drag, then flicked ash into the tray. Look at New Orleans, he said. Those guys have been at it since the 1880s. They got lynched in the 1890s and went underground so deep, most people forgot they existed. But those Sicilians down there? They're serious. Same in Pittston, same in Philly. These families aren't new blood. They were around before Luciano, before Gambino, before Maranzano. Real heavyweights. Tommy leaned back, letting the idea settle in. We need to start leaning on them, Maya said. Bring them into the circle. Make them allies. We talk to Magadino up in Buffalo. We build a national network, north, south, east, and west. Then we take it to Frank. We tie it in with Tammany Hall with the Irish. That old machine still works. Lucchese smirked. And once Tammany's fused with our network up here, and the political hubs down south in Louisiana? Lansky finished the thought for him. It won't matter if the guy in office is a Democrat or a Republican. He crushed out his cigarette. We'll own them both. Lansky leaned in closer. We've got to start organizing, reconnecting the networks. You spoke to our friends in Pennsylvania lately? You mean the Volpe, Magadino, or the Buffalino crowd? Tommy asked. Yeah, all three, Maya said with a huge smile. I've been bringing Gambino up to speed. Those guys, they're the real old-timers. Quiet, smart, disciplined. They don't make noise unless it's necessary. Lucchese exhaled slowly. If we won a stranglehold on the garment district, it can't be local anymore. It has to be national. We control every link in the chain. Production, transport, the unions, the loans. That means going to the source. Lansky nodded. They get their coal from Pennsylvania, their oil from southern Pennsylvania, the Midwest, Texas, the South. That's what fuels everything: steel, rubber, textiles, food. We lock that down. We own the economy. The trucks, the warehouses, the rail lines, the factories and the banks. And the favors, Tommy added. Exactly, Lansky said. We don't just sit on top of the rackets. We become the infrastructure. But first, we need to understand Pennsylvania better than we do now. That territory's old school. Serious men, long memories. Lucchese leaned forward, a spark in his eyes. Then we make some visits. By the early 1930s, the bootleggers had found their next big score. Not in speakeasies or gambling halls, but in the chaos of legitimate business. Prohibition was winding down, but the streets were still full of men who understood how to squeeze a nickel from a neighborhood and turn a handshake into an empire. The smart ones didn't just move into gambling, they moved into infrastructure. They took over the transportation systems, the factories, the warehouses, and then they went for the beating heart of New York's post-war economy, the garment industry. It wasn't a heist. It was a merger. Behind the storefronts and mannequins, 7th Avenue had become a gangster's playground. It was messy, unregulated, ruthlessly competitive, and perfect. 1 in every 10 dresses sold across America came out of this maze of low-rent jobbers, high-end showrooms, and overcrowded sweatshops. No one company owned more than 4% of the business. But 5 men, only 5, controlled nearly 10%. Not through innovation, but intimidation. Thomas "3-Finger Brown" Lucchese, James "Big Nig" Rosen, Jimmy Doyle Plumery, Harry "Boom Boom" Levine, and a man almost invisible to the public, Abe Shea Chait, a trucker who moved everything and answered to no one. Together, they operated like a silent board of directors behind New York's largest legitimate industry. Through front companies, relatives, and silent partnerships, they had a grip on at least $100 million in annual wholesale volume and influence over $200 million more. That made them kings of a billion-dollar empire built on silk, polyester, and fear. The appeal wasn't just profit, it was structure. No single firm had real dominance. The business changed by the season, styles came and went, fortunes rose and fell overnight. A 2-cent margin on a $4 dress could mean the difference between flying to Miami or folding by winter. That kind of desperation bred deals in back alleys. It invited gamblers. It attracted men who knew how to enforce silence. The low-end dress market became a jungle. West 35th Street was its hunting ground. They called it the Chinatown of fashion. But this wasn't just about dresses. Trucking rates, piecework, labor costs. These were the places gangsters lived now. A union official here, a contractor there. The mob could offer a jobber an edge in delivery times or protection from strikes, or they could withdraw it, leaving merchandise to rot and orders to disappear. Want the union to look the other way? That came at a price. Want the racketeers off your back? That came with terms. Honest businesses were forced to make choices, cut deals, give up equity, or get crushed. And so, one by one, they capitulated. Behind the factories, behind the showrooms, were legitimate-looking balance sheets hiding millions in dirty money. The IRS couldn't track it. One former investigator said you could comb through the mob's books for 6 years and come out dumber than when you started. What mattered most wasn't just the money. It was the access. Owning garment firms, fronting manufacturers, and bribing truckers gave mobsters entry into the rooms where politics, business, and labor intersected. Respectability was no longer a problem. They were dining with city officials, donating to campaigns, and being introduced at union events like CEOs. A Cadillac and a good tailor made you legitimate. And in the eyes of the city, these men had both. But that legitimacy came at a cost. Sweatshops in the city multiplied. Labor standards collapsed. Racketeers encouraged manufacturers to move payrolls out of New York, draining millions from the city's economy and sending them to out-of-town cut-rate contractors. Negro and Puerto Rican workers, new to the country and desperate for work, were paid starvation wages. Many ended up on welfare, and the city's relief rolls exploded. What wasn't said publicly was whispered privately. New York's taxpayers were subsidizing the Mafia's garment profits. And still, no one could prove it. Every line in the books looked clean. The unions, especially the International Ladies Garment Workers Union under David Dubinsky, fought back. But even there, the rot had spread. Minor union officials were compromised. Kickbacks were routine. The lines between legal and criminal blurred until they no longer existed. By the 1940s, organized crime wasn't just making money off the garment industry. They were the garment industry. By the mid-20th century, the underworld's grip on the garment industry was no longer a rumor passed in back alleys. It was fact. They weren't shaking down corner bookies anymore. They were owning real companies, moving product in and out of one of the city's most chaotic commercial ecosystems. And at the center of this stranglehold stood Abraham Abe Shea Chait. Chait wasn't the kind of gangster who showed up in newspapers unless something went wrong. He hated publicity, avoided it like a subpoena. But among the biggest 5 power players who controlled the garment district's backbone, the trucking, the name Abe Chait carried weight, and not just because of his size. He was 6 feet of muscle, dressed in mohair and silence, the man who supposedly paid $1 million to buy Thomas "ThreeFinger Brown" Luces' stake in the garment rackets outright. Law enforcement sources quietly agreed. If anyone could be called a czar of New York's trucking empire, it was Chait. He came from the streets of the Bronx and had a record going back to 1917. In 1918, he was convicted of grand larceny and sent to Sing Sing for almost 7 years. He had no real education to speak of, but that didn't stop him from building something big. In 1924, he launched Faultless Trucking. By 1932, he founded Champion Trucking with just $20,000, a modest sum that grew suspiciously fast, especially during the lean years of the Depression. The old habits followed him. In 1933, Chait was arrested in connection with a car used to help South Dakota killer Verna Miller escape an FBI trap in Chicago. Chait claimed he was only helping out another ex-con from Sing Sing, but that friend never testified. His body turned up mutilated and dumped in Connecticut 2 weeks later. Chait walked. Lack of evidence. By the 1940s and 1950s, Chait had gone legitimate, at least on paper. He was chairman of the board at Champion Trucking, headquartered on West 36th Street, the heart of the garment center. His business was logistics, but what he really controlled was access. If you wanted your dresses delivered on time and intact, you dealt with Chait. If you didn't, your product sat or disappeared. His reach extended far beyond Manhattan, to Pittston, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and Binghamton, Pennsylvania, deep into the routes that fed the fashion capital from the manufacturing hubs in the East. Chait lived modestly by his standards, a rent-controlled apartment in Washington Heights with a view of Fort Tryon Park and the Hudson. Lavish tips, quiet manners, no public fights. But his real domain sat miles away in Putnam Valley. There, behind twin stone pillars and a private bridge labelled Chait, was his 24-acre retreat, Good News Farm. A private estate complete with a red-roofed house, stables, a Hollywood-style pool, and year-round staff. For someone who came up the hard way, as his neighbours put it, Chait made sure he didn't go back. He even tried his hand at high society. Through his wife, Sarah, and their son, Burton, the Chaits ventured into horse racing. They called themselves Putnam Stables, and at one point, Burton owned 1,500 shares of Yonkers Raceway. Their most successful horse, Combat Boots, earned over $125,000. But the racing circuit wasn't buying the clean image. After a string of scandals, the family's license was revoked in 1954. The stock remained a point of contention in ongoing lawsuits. Despite this, Chait kept to himself. In Putnam Valley, he was quiet. No wild parties, no noise, just a Cadillac up the West Side Highway and a daily drop-off at his Manhattan office. He didn't talk to reporters. He didn't pose for photos. His name was barely on paper, but his signature was on every deal that mattered in the garment district's hidden economy. It wasn't just dresses they were moving. It was payrolls, influence, power. Abe Chait's trucking companies were more than just delivery outfits. They were the veins feeding a billion-dollar industry, one where an inch of leverage was worth millions, and every competitor paid for the privilege of staying in business. For Chait, it wasn't about guns or street brawls. It was about paperwork, contacts, and silence. And he was just one name in a growing list of men who'd figured out the future of organized crime wasn't in speakeasies or pool halls. It was in industry. In the world of racketeering, where empires weren't just built on cash but on bloodlines, marriage certificates could be just as potent as murder contracts. If there were ever a criminal version of Burke's peerage, it would have charted a royal family of crime rooted deep in the folds of New York's garment district. From 35th to 39th Street, amid the rolling racks of cheap dresses and luxury coats, the mob stitched together a criminal syndicate that reached from New York to Pennsylvania, from Cuba to the federal bench. The 5 names that sat at the top of this empire weren't just thugs. They were industrialists in pinstripes. Abraham Chait, Thomas "ThreeFinger" Brown, Lucchese, quietly flanked by Carlo Gambino, Benjamin Boom Boom Levine, Harry Big Nig Rosen Stromberg, James Jimmy Doyle Plumeri. They didn't just control trucks, they controlled contracts, unions, storefronts, politicians, and they did it in broad daylight. These men weren't separate entities, they were a web, married into one another's families, partners in delivery companies, investors in the same dress firms, co-defendants in narcotics cases. Their operations were seamless. Every delivery truck, every bolt of cloth, every low-wage union worker on the floor was part of their structure. Burton Chait, Abraham's son, had already learned the game as a college freshman. In 1947, instead of returning to Syracuse, he bought into Merit Dress Delivery on 36th Street, a company owned by Joseph Joe Palisades Rosato, Lucchese's brother-in-law. Another partner? Charles Goldman, ex-president of the Cloak and Suit Trucking Association. And then there was Max Posner, who linked directly to Big John Ormento, one of Lucchese's lieutenants and a regular at Appalachian. Ormento's son married into the Livorsi family, Frank Cheech Livorsi being one of the most notorious names in narcotics. Cheech's bloodline alone was a directory of criminal alliances. One daughter married into the Detroit mob through Angelo Mealy. Another married Thomas Dio Guardia, brother of Johnny Dio. Plumeri, sitting high in the garment racket, was their uncle. And Mealy. He was uncle to Russell Bufalino, the Pennsylvania godfather and garment manufacturer who quietly forged his own network among the Pittston and Scranton contracting shops. By the time of the Appalachian meeting, the ties had grown impossible to untangle. The garment industry wasn't just infected, it was organized. Bufalino's presence there wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. His reach stretched across eastern Pennsylvania through men like Dominic Alaimo, Angelo Ciandra, and James Ostico, names that surfaced in boardrooms, not mugshots. Alaimo himself co-owned the Jane Hogan Dress Company in Pittston, a subcontractor for Smart Sue and Studio Frocks, both controlled by Chait's interests. And from the outside, it looked legitimate. In the books, it was business. In the street, it was dominant. Benjamin Levine had made his bones under Lepke Buchalter and Gurra Shapiro back in the 1930s, doing extortion runs and union adjustments that got him a year at Rikers. But he came out smart. By the 1950s, he was a quiet mogul. Through Scott Enterprises and a web of shell companies, Levine ran Duchess Royal, Donna Scott, Patricia Scott, and a dozen others. The sales from one company alone, Walter Scott Originals, topped $4.5 million annually. His sons fronted it, but he was still the one pulling the strings. His rivals and partners saw the same playbook. Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, used Harry Strasser as a front in the Madison Dress Company and the Nuremberg operations in Pennsylvania. When he started pushing deeper into garment turf and sniffing around Cuban gambling, Anastasia got clipped. It wasn't just about gaming tables in Havana. It was about freight, fabric, and power. Even Meyer Lansky, the architect of the casino empire in Cuba, had once cut his teeth in the garment trade. Pictures of him with the Levine boys at the opening of the Riviera Hotel in Havana weren't just photo ops. They were statements. Dress money funded casino tables. Casino money came back to buy more buildings on 5th and Lexington. Gambino, never one to miss a good investment, placed his own family right into the business. His son Thomas married Lucchese's daughter and opened Peggy Ann Dress Company in Pennsylvania. The shop contracted Levine's network and even worked with Stromberg's old contacts. It was a subtle way for Gambino to lock in loyalty, expand his reach beyond New York, and keep the books clean. But behind the fabric were drugs. Less than a year before this story hit the wire, Stromberg had been convicted for bankrolling an international narcotics ring. A few weeks later, Levine, living a suburban life in a $150,000 home on Atlantic Beach, was arrested for the same thing. The lesser brothers, two nobodies, were already in prison from the Stromberg side of the operation. The feds also bagged Natale Evola, another Appalachian attendee and owner of garment trucking outfits, along with Andine Papadio, frontman for Lucchese's Pilgrim Dress Company. Ormento, tied in blood and business, was right in the middle. And that brings it back to Pennsylvania. Plumeri, another of the five, was the man who brought the garment business across the Delaware River. He set up shop in Pittston and Larksville with locals like Alimo and Berger, the Dio brothers, and Sam Berger helping muscle in the trucking unions. Paper locals, forged contracts, forced dues. Plumeri's method was simple: buy it, bully it, bury it. The board of the Pennsylvania Garment Manufacturers Association was meant to guide policy and protect jobs, is stacked with men like Alimo, Stromberg's partners, and Bufalino's allies. They don't set trends, they set rules. And the contractors? They do what they're told. When to open, when to shut, what wages to pay. It's not a trade, it's a racket with a tailor's tag. The garment business wasn't just a criminal opportunity. It was the foundation of a modern empire. And while the waterfront and the docks got all the headlines, the real money moved quietly, on the backs of underpaid workers, through silent warehouses, sewn with invisible thread by men who learned long ago how to hide blood behind silk. By the 1950s, the New York Garment District had earned a fitting nickname: the Jungle. What was once a symbol of immigrant opportunity had become a billion-dollar business so morally corrupted, so tangled in organized crime, that even insiders couldn't deny its rot. On the surface, storefronts glittered and racks rolled out endless streams of dresses, but just beneath, every seam told a story of shakedowns, theft, exploitation, and blood. Industry figures like Louis Rubin tried to minimize it. Because you got to pay a trucker something extra after hours, which means you shouldn't kiss your children at night, he asked, shrugging off the under-the-table payments as mere necessities of doing business. Rubin insisted it was all about style, not the edge, not the underworld leverage that determined who got goods delivered on time, who had access to labor, or who got to stay in business. But even style wasn't safe. Piracy was the unspoken trade. Spotters from lower-end dress houses stood outside Fifth Avenue department stores when the displays changed, sketching the new designs as the curtains went up. Copyists made minor tweaks, slapped on a new label, and sent the original dresses back for credit. Fast fashion, mob style. At street level, there was another kind of theft, gritty, manual, and relentless. It started with walking thieves, former pushcart kids who evolved into specialists. The readers trailed carts, learned the delivery route, then showed up at the next stop, yelling at drivers like angry foremen, "Where the hell you been?" In the confusion, they'd sign the receipt and walk off with thousands in goods. The slashers didn't bother talking. With razors tucked into their sleeves, they walked alongside carts and slit the canvas in seconds, grabbing handfuls of garments before vanishing into the side streets. Others graduated into hijacking crews. One truck pulled up beside another, a quick spring of the lock, and the contents were gone in just 2 minutes. That's what drivers always said. Just 2 minutes for a coffee. But in those 2 minutes, as much as $60,000 in merchandise could disappear. The king of this game was a character they called 80 Keys. His racket was simple: rent as many trucks as possible, copy every key, and then return the trucks on time. When cash was needed, he'd walk the district looking for one of his trucks. He'd open it, drive off, and be gone before anyone noticed. One man, one haul, no violence, just control. The Cargo Protection Bureau estimated losses at $3.5 million a year. But that was only the thefts they could count. Behind these crimes, the racketeers maintained their image of respectability. One executive tried to describe how clean his end of the business was. "We're so different from the low-end field. We knock before entering the model's dressing room." But that didn't stop the flow of tribute. Most houses paid to stay open. Some paid to eliminate competition. Almost all paid to get their work done cheaper. That's where men like Louis Stromberg, brother of narcotics financier Harry Big Nig Rosen Stromberg, came in. Louis wasn't a thug, he was a finder. He helped companies locate cut-rate contractors, usually in places like Pittston or Scranton, Pennsylvania, where labor was desperate and unions were weak. He charged a fee of 2 to 15 cents per dress. That small cut bought silence from unions, blind eyes from inspectors, and access to workrooms no one asked too many questions about. Companies that used him: Miss Linda Fashions, Miss Judy Lee Fashions. Both operated out of 463 7th Avenue. Louis didn't just find them any contractor, he directed them to Peggy Ann Dress Company in Peckville, Pennsylvania. Peggy Ann wasn't just another shop. It was run by Thomas Gambino, son of Carlo Gambino, husband to Lucchese's daughter, and one of the quietest, most powerful forces in the post-Appalachian underworld. It was a non-union shop. And while the penalty for using such a shop was officially 8.5% of labor costs paid to the ILGW's pension and welfare fund, the cost was easily absorbed by the profits saved. Another shop housed in that same building, Studio Frocks, had been a direct interest of Harry Stromberg. That single company had ordered dresses from over 50 Pennsylvania contractors and 8 non-union shops in New York over the last few years. This was no coincidence. It was a structure. Every detail was accounted for. The dress industry had become a system not just of commerce, but of control. A place where the modern mob didn't need to kill, they only needed to undercut. The criminals weren't hiding in alleys. They were walking showroom floors, running payrolls, collecting invoices, and arranging credit. Respectability was the new muscle, and the garment district was its stage. The garment rackets weren't just a New York story. They bled out into Pennsylvania, stitching a shadow economy into every alleyway of Pittston, Wilkes-Barre, and Scranton. And at the heart of this off-the-books empire, beyond the dress shops, coal shafts, and crooked political machines, was a man who said little but saw everything. Russell Bufalino. Bufalino was nobody's idea of a street boss. He didn't bark orders or grandstand in clubs. He moved through quiet meetings, quiet lunches, and quiet handshakes. But behind the stillness was leverage. Pennsylvania had what the syndicate needed: coal, steel, and oil, the lifeblood of America's industrial arteries. To keep the garment factories humming and the trucking fleets moving, Carlo Gambino and his New York interests needed Pennsylvania's resources. More than that, they needed control of the terrain. And in Pittston, control came in the shape of Santo Volpe, the old king of the hill. They called him the king of the coal fields. Volpe had clawed his way to power back when Italian immigrants were still outnumbered by the Irish in the mines. His enforcer back then was a young Joseph Barbara, the same man who'd later host the infamous Appalachian meeting. Volpe didn't just control rackets. He controlled political appointments. He got himself placed on the State Coal Commission, which regulated how much coal could be pulled from the ground. That gave him real muscle, not just in the mines, but in Harrisburg too. And when power had to shift to survive, Volpe did what the smart ones always do. He passed the reins without losing his grip. Enter William Medico, the polished businessman with a sinister pedigree. His sister married Volpe's son. Another Medico girl married James Anthony Ostico, Medico's transportation boss and a guest at Appalachian. Through Medico Industries, Volpe's influence merged seamlessly with legitimate enterprise, factories, trucking, steel contracts. And Bufalino? He was never far behind. Bufalino, along with Dominic Alaimo, Angelo Ciandra, and Ostico, formed the nucleus of the Pennsylvania crime family's garment empire. They weren't just connected to the New York Five families, they served them, especially Gambino. Because Gambino understood what many others didn't, that power isn't just about violence, it's about infrastructure. With union battles exploding in New York and labor costs climbing, the Pennsylvania towns became a godsend. Pittston's mines had collapsed. Workers were idle. Women flooded into garment factories for pennies on the dollar. By 1958, 63 dress contracting firms had set up shop across the region. Most were tied to the men from Appalachian. All of them, directly or not, owed their survival to Bufalino and his network. Tommy "ThreeFinger Brown" Lucchese, who had his own stake in these operations, extended his trust to Gambino, who played it quiet. Gambino's son Thomas married Lucchese's daughter and opened Peggy Ann Dress Company in Peckville, Pennsylvania, a non-union shop that benefited from reduced costs and Medico's muscle. This wasn't an accident, it was design. Gambino didn't shout. He just inserted himself where power already existed and made sure it stayed there. And power in Pittston was real. Arthur Lorry learned that the hard way. A local dress manufacturer, he tried to go independently. One night, somebody broke into his shop and smashed every sewing machine with surgical precision. Each one hit in just the right place to render it useless. 2 other independent plants burned to the ground shortly after. Even Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner himself, didn't walk through Pennsylvania unannounced. He had dress shops of his own and would occasionally stop into New York's Hotel Forest Bar, where Plumeri, Alaimo, and Bufalino gathered to coordinate contracts. Anastasia understood something others only whispered. This wasn't a side business. This was the business. The Flatiron Building in Pittston, a modest facade on the outside, became the informal headquarters. The bottom floor had a bar and grill. The back rooms were set up for cards. Upstairs, 17 rooms, each with a bed, were fitted for visiting guests. It was a syndicated clubhouse disguised as a garment annex. Then there was politics. John Keogh, the Irish patriarch of Luzerne County, ruled from his wheelchair like a feudal baron. He delivered votes by the tens of thousands, Democratic, Republican, it didn't matter. But to hold his ground, even Keogh had to play ball with the new power structure. That meant giving Medico influence. That meant aligning, even begrudgingly, with the Italians. When Medico needed his brother-in-law Ostico to become Pittston's chief of police, Keogh almost made it happen. But after the Appalachian fiasco, the deal crumbled. Mayor Patrick O'Brien, an independent voice, blocked the appointment. A few weeks later, O'Brien was run off the road by an unknown vehicle and nearly killed. Nobody said anything, but the message was loud enough. And through it all, Bufalino watched. He was Medico's shadow. He moved money, whispered in ears, filed business licenses, opened new companies, like BS Construction, standing for Bufalino, Ciandra, and Alaimo. The BS wasn't lost on anyone. The garment industry became the front, but what it fronted was national. Narcotics moved through the same trucking lines. Union shakedowns were brokered in back rooms of garment offices. Payments were laundered through shops that sold $1 million in coats while barely printing receipts. And always, Gambino had a seat at the table. It wasn't just about fashion. It was about supply, power, and a pipeline that ran from the coalfields of Pittston all the way to Mulberry Street. By 1958, the Mafia's grip on the garment industry had come under fire, but it wasn't going down without a fight. At the center of it all stood Abraham Glassberg, a stocky, shrewd operator who founded the Pennsylvania Garment Manufacturers Association, PGMA, in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. With 190 dress contractors under his banner and over 25,000 workers on the books, mostly women working for next to nothing, Glassberg publicly welcomed any investigation. But sitting beside his lawyer, he looked every bit the man with something to hide. The PGMA was born out of desperation and design. As the coal mines of northeastern Pennsylvania dried up, New York jobbers fled the city's union strongholds and set up shop in cheap labor towns like Pittston, Wilkes-Barre, and Scranton. Glassberg spearheaded that exodus, opening 23 plants in old mining communities. The wives of unemployed miners filled the sewing floors, working at minimum wage under non-union conditions. PGMA jobbers boasted margins of 50 cents per dress, more than their 7th Avenue competitors, and that was enough to make or break a racket. Glassberg's influence was stitched together by more than factory floor ingenuity. He cultivated political ties, bankrolled the garment industry-dominated Liberal Party in New York, and kept union organizers at bay with a mix of intimidation and bureaucratic resistance. He railed against ILGWU leader David Dubinsky, claiming he was trying to destroy Pennsylvania's needle trades. But behind that rhetoric lay darker connections. 4 of Glassberg's 8 PGMA board members had direct links to the underworld. Dominic Alaimo, co-owner of Jane Hogan Dress Company in Pittston, had stood shoulder to shoulder with fellow Appalachian attendees James Ostico and Angelo Ciandra. All were connected to James Jimmy Doyle Plumery and narcotics-linked hoodlum Frankie Carbo. John George, alias John San Giorgio, managed Glassberg's Clover Dress Company before moving to run Tommy Lucchese's Harvick plant in Scranton. Lewis Carter, another Glassberg associate, had deep roots in PGMA-linked shops, and Glassberg's own son, Nathan, was in the business. Clover Dress, Glassberg's pride, was founded by Sarah Chait, wife of trucking boss Abe Chait, and Harry Lugai Frocks Toffel. The Chait-Glassberg alliance was no secret in the underworld. Smart Sue Incorporated, another beneficiary of their empire, sourced garments from non-union shops like Peggy Ann in Peckville, run by Thomas Gambino, Carlo Gambino's son and Lucchese's son-in-law. These companies operated out of 462 and 463. 7th Avenue, addresses synonymous with illicit influence. Studio Frocks, once under the Chaits and Toffel, employed Alaimo and had financial ties to narcotics figure Harry Stromberg, brother of the infamous sweatshop finder Lou Stromberg. When the ILGWU contract came up for renewal in early 1958, Toffel led 70 jobbers out of the industry's official negotiating group and into rebellion alongside the PGMA. Together, they attempted to forge their own wage deal, bypassing Dubinsky and creating a separate deal that excluded Pennsylvania oversight. The goal? Cement the non-union edge. Dubinsky struck back. With the support of New York's legitimate manufacturers, he launched a general strike on March 5th, the ILGWU's first in 25 years. 105,000 workers walked off. PGMA plants were picketed, trucks were raided, and dresses were seized. In New York, the strike ended within a week. But in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, it dragged on for 6 more. Glassberg and his allies held out. Clover stayed shut. Harvick, managed by Lucchese's man St. George, remained locked. Lucchese's son, Robert, an ex-Air Force lieutenant with no flair for dresses, disappeared from the plant floor. John St. George posted signs warning workers that the $1 minimum wage was final. The presser remembered him ranting and screaming. Peggy Ann in Peckville kept producing. Under police escort, Freedman's Express transported dresses from the factory to Chait's Smart Sue, incorporated in New York. Police Chief George Nowitzki waved off union concerns. "They obey the law here," he shrugged. As the strike wore on, most PGMA members folded. They signed individual agreements with the union or joined legitimate contractors' associations. Former PGMA Vice President Irvine Jackman said, "There's nothing to revive." but Glassberg insisted that 30% of members still paid dues. St. George called it a going organization. Lucchese quietly began to withdraw. Harvick's machines were moved to a new site. The only outfit still running openly was Peggy Ann, shielded by local law and powered by the Gambino-Lucchese alliance. Glassberg, meanwhile, returned from a secret trip to Atlanta and Nashville. He claimed to be out of the business, but 3 clover plants still bore his mark. He dodged questions about future plans. Yet while Glassberg and his partners took the hits, the Pittston faction regrouped. Bufalino, Alaimo, and Sciandra, fresh off their Appalachian exposure, filed paperwork for a new operation, a BS construction company. Out of the garment shadows, into new territory. A for Angelo, the brother of Russell Bufalino. The B stood for Russell Bufalino, and the S stood for Sciandra. But the playbook remained unchanged, and all of it had started long before. Back in the mid-1940s, this empire was just a concept. Carlo Gambino, then a quiet, calculating subordinate, understood the value of silence. Russell Bufalino, ever invisible, forged ties in coal towns and trucking lanes. Lucchese planted his people in small-town plants and seeded influence in places like Scranton, Peckville, and Wilkes-Barre. It began with runaways from New York, fleeing Union control, and setting up plants in coal country. It began with trucking deals and sweetheart leases, with Sarah Chait founding dress companies, with jobbers like Toffel bypassing regulations, with Smart Sue Incorporated and Studio Frocks operating as laundromats for underworld capital, and with a single shared understanding. To control the garment business was to control the supply lines of America itself. And the men behind it? Gambino, Lucchese, Bufalino, Volpe, Alaimo, Chait, Plumeri, Sciandra, Stromberg, Toffel, Glassberg. This was the end of one battle, not the war. But it took nearly 20 years to reach this point. Because back in the mid-1940s, this entire empire was just beginning to take shape. It started with small trucking outfits, like Chait's Champion Trucking, moving dresses and cash under the radar. It started with runaway jobbers seeking cheap labor in coal country, backed by quiet men like Bufalino and Volpe. It started when Lucchese and Gambino, 2 bosses who rarely raised their voices, began to knit together a network that would stretch from the sweatshops of Brooklyn to the sewing floors of Scranton. And it started with the understanding that control, real control, wasn't just about guns or threats. It was about infrastructure, about supply, about industry. It was about putting a hand on the wheel of America's economy and never letting go. By the time most people realized what had happened, the Mafia wasn't muscling in on the garment business. They were the garment business. Carlo Gambino was now sitting atop a quiet fortune, a compact empire built on loyalty, low profiles, and long memories. He had what every man in that life wanted: money, influence, and above all, respect. Real respect. The kind that came not from fear alone, but from usefulness. Gambino wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. What he had was far more dangerous. Access. He and his brother had been helping Albert, the Mad Hatter Anastasia, and Tough Tony Anastasio run the Brooklyn waterfront. Carlo didn't command the docks, but he helped move the gears behind the curtain. Every shipment that passed, every envelope that changed hands, made him a little more valuable. When Anastasia began to expand his reach into Pennsylvania under the guise of aiding the war effort, Gambino followed. Quietly, calculated, patient. It was in that transition, bridging Brooklyn to Pennsylvania, that Gambino became something more than a soldier. He was now a facilitator, a connector, a necessary piece. That's when he linked up with Frank Scalise, a man of power and brutality, respected and feared in equal measure. Scalise had his own crew of loyal executioners, Men who'd slit a throat before breakfast and sit down to coffee like nothing happened. And Frank didn't just respect Gambino. He depended on him. He saw Carlo not as a threat, but as a fellow Sicilian, a fellow Palermo man, one of their own. The Castellano family, Paul, Peter, and the wider bloodline, had once brought Carlo in as a protégé. They taught him the rules, fed him deals, shielded him in his leaner years. Now they watched with pride as he grew. Their investment was paying dividends. This was more than a crime family. This was a Sicilian dynasty. Cousins, uncles, brothers, all in on the same game, each playing a role. Carlo was the quiet muscle wrapped in velvet gloves. But make no mistake, he could squeeze hard when he had to. He was now working with Joe Adonis, helping Luciano run his rackets while keeping his mouth shut and his books clean. Tommy Lucchese, ThreeFinger Brown, trusted him like a brother. Lucchese saw Gambino as a man of the future, a vital cog in the Galliano machine. And if Tommy trusted him, that meant Galliano did too. They both knew Gambino was a long-term play. They could hand over territory and sleep easily at night. In Philadelphia, Gambino was cleaning up with Nick Rosen, running numbers and moving product with industrial precision. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, he had the respect of Russell Bufalino, Angelo Ciandra, and a score of quiet bosses who understood one truth. In this life, talent was currency, and Gambino had more of it than most. They didn't see him as a threat. Not yet. Just a man to watch, a man to respect. But they knew, especially in Pennsylvania, that talent like that didn't stay in one place for long. Talent drifted. It waited for time to do its work. Down south, Carlos Marcello was on the rise. He'd heard of Gambino. Everyone had. And Marcello was already doing business with him, funneling profits through oil rackets, gas stations, and truck depots stretching from New York to New Orleans. It wasn't just money. It was infrastructure. It was survival. And over in Florida, Santo Taficante Sr. and his boy, Santo Jr., were building their own dynasty. Gambino helped them keep the New York families happy. He had his fingers in their Miami operations, kept the lines open, and the profits clean. Senior was preparing Junior for the throne, and Gambino was already grooming allies. It was the future. And it was being shaped in dark corners and smoke-filled rooms. The old guard, Anastasia, Costello, even Luciano, was starting to thin out. What came next would be born from these alliances, stitched together by men who never raised their voices and never lost their cool. But even as the empire spread, the shadows got longer. There was one threat that loomed over them all. A slow-moving plague with a name they all knew: deportation. By the early 1940s, the government had already drawn its knife. Federal agents were combing through immigration files, building cases, stacking warrants. On December 26, 1940, right after spending Christmas with his family, Carlo Gambino got the knock. He'd been picked up as an illegal alien. At the time, it didn't mean much. Gambino could afford the best lawyers. And America was preparing for war. Even if an order to ship him back to Sicily had been issued, it would have been impossible. Transports were military now. Nobody was wasting ships on deporting gangsters. So the case was quietly shelved, stuck in a drawer inside the immigration and naturalization files. And there it stayed, dusty, forgotten, for over a dozen years. But it wasn't dead, because in the early 1960s, that same file was pulled out, reopened, and placed on the desk of the Kennedy administration. Alongside it were files on Marcello, Lucchese, Costello, Adonis, and Bufalino. Washington had a new weapon, and they were going to use it. But all of that was still far off, a war away, a presidency away. Back in the mid-1940s, the foundation was still being laid. The men who would come to define organized crime for the next 3 decades were still building their empires, not with bullets, but with contracts, marriages, storefronts, and front companies. Carlo Gambino was one of them, maybe the most dangerous of them all, because he didn't fight for the throne, he waited for it. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor went up in smoke. The Japanese Imperial Navy struck like ghosts in the early morning, torpedoes slicing through still waters, bombs tearing apart the US Pacific Fleet. Battleships were burning, sailors drowning, and America, blindsided and humiliated, was now at war. But for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the attack wasn't just a tragedy. It was an opportunity. For years he had been walking a political tightrope, held back by a country that danced with fascism in the ballroom of isolationism, especially in the American South, where sympathy for Mussolini still ran deep. Roosevelt wanted to hit back hard. He wanted the Pacific. He wanted Japan. But before he could declare anything, Adolf Hitler, blinded by arrogance, did the unthinkable. He declared war on the United States first, thinking Roosevelt would inevitably drag his country into Europe anyway. Roosevelt didn't blink. He stood before Congress and the American people and made it clear. The United States had done nothing to provoke Germany, but now they were going to finish the job. That meant war in Europe. That meant Italy. That meant fascism. Everywhere. And suddenly, the Italian-American underworld had leverage. The US government began reaching out, quietly, discreetly, to certain figures who knew the Italian language and the Sicilian mentality better than any translator. They weren't going to find allies in Mussolini's sympathizers. But the men who hated Mussolini, the ones he'd locked up, tortured, exiled, they were on the street corners of Little Italy, and many of them wore $1,000 suits and carried switchblades behind their silk ties. These were men like Charles Lucky Luciano and Albert Anastasia. They didn't wave the American flag, but they had been brutalized by Mussolini's purges, and now Washington needed their eyes and ears. But it wasn't just about intelligence, it was about survival. Naval intelligence agents started showing up at the ports. They were asking questions, checking manifests, watching the docks. What they didn't realize was that Anastasia's men had already been watching them. Every step, every whisper. And it didn't take long before a little light bulb went off in Albert Anastasia's head. Before he pitched it to Luciano, the war had already delivered something else to the Mangano family and to young Carlo Gambino. It wasn't just about patriotism or revenge. It was about business. $100 million business built around war bonds, ration stamps, and profiteering on the home front. The underworld moved fast. If the government needed roads, they needed coal. If they needed ships, they needed steel. If they needed to move men and materials, they needed oil. And they needed the mob. The Mafia in Pennsylvania controlled the coal. The Mafia in Louisiana controlled the oil. The unions, the trucking companies, the ports, they were already under mob control. Now the government had no choice but to look the other way, or in some cases to work with them directly. Luciano's syndicate was about to become an asset, but the government had to come to them. That's when Anastasia started looking at a French liner docked in New York Harbor, a luxury ship turned troop transport. Its name, the Normandy. Settimo Big Sam. Accardi was born on October 23, 1902, in Vita, Sicily. By the time his boots touched American soil, he wasn't chasing a dream. He was building an empire. He slipped into the country through Cherbourg, France, in 1927, listing Vita as his hometown. But everyone who knew him understood. Big Sam wasn't coming to start a life. He was coming to control one. By the late 1930s, he had positioned himself in the thick of the bootleg trade that stretched across New Jersey. When federal indictments came crashing down on more than 100 men tied to an alcohol ring in Vineland, Accardi's name was near the top of the list. He was described as one of the big shots in a conspiracy that was pumping illegal liquor through underground stills, while dirty cops and crooked politicians looked the other way. His connections ran so deep that when an illegal still exploded in Malaga in 1935, killing 2 men, Accardi reportedly paid off local police to stay silent. One officer testified under oath that Accardi tried to hand him a $50 bill at City Hall. When the officer refused, Big Sam stood up in federal court years later and called him a liar in front of the judge. Accardi wasn't just another rum runner. He was part of a new breed, men who understood how to blend brute force with political insulation. He worked with Joseph Seeker, Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, and Longis Willman, but his quiet, strategic bond with Carlo Gambino is what lifted him above the street. During World War II, as the government handed out ration cards for essentials like food and fuel, Accardi saw opportunity. He became one of the earliest and most effective black marketeers in ration stamps, moving forged cards through a network that included Gambino and his growing influence in Brooklyn. They didn't just steal, they systematized. Accardi and Gambino were running a wartime fraud so lucratively that the government couldn't keep up with its spread. It was quiet, effective, and backed by the threat of violence. In 1945, Accardi became a naturalized US citizen, but he got there by lying. He failed to disclose arrests tied to bootlegging and racketeering, including his role in the Vineland ring. His story was thin, claiming he worked full-time for the Josephine dress shop and the American Buttonhole Company, but federal records showed he barely stepped foot in either. He was already a man with over a dozen federal charges under his belt, and by 1951 he pleaded guilty to operating another illegal still in New York. He served a year in prison and paid a $5,000 fine. That same year, the IRS slapped him with a tax lien for nearly $160,000. The government had enough. By 1952, U.S. Attorney Grover Richman filed a petition to have Accardi denaturalized and deported to Italy. In a packed Newark courtroom, federal prosecutors detailed how Accardi had defrauded the system to secure his citizenship. They called it a test case trial balloon in the Justice Department's new push to purge America of foreign-born racketeers. The courtroom turned theatrical. Accardi pleaded the Fifth. His lawyer insisted he was protected under the Constitution, but Judge Richard Hartshorn wasn't swayed. No one compelled him to ask for citizenship, he said. He took the stand on his own volition and asked for the greatest gift you can get in America. Accardi lost. His citizenship was revoked on July 10, 1953. Deportation proceedings began immediately, but he wasn't finished playing games. In 1955, he was arrested again on a federal narcotics charge in Newark. The bond was high, $92,000. He paid it and vanished. He re-emerged in Turin, Italy, running heroin across the Atlantic. When the heat followed him, he relocated to Toronto, Canada, where he continued to oversee shipments into New York and Montreal. He wasn't a ghost. He was a shadow, still in business. The feds finally tracked him down in 1960 and spent 3 years fighting to bring him back. On November 28, 1963, Accardi was extradited to New York. By July 21, 1964, he was convicted of narcotics, conspiracy, and bail jumping. A month later, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison and fined $16,000. His story ended on December 3, 1977. But the trail he left behind told a deeper story of wartime black markets, bootleg empires, and political corruption greased by bribes and fear. He had moved with killers, racketeers, and bosses, but Settimo Accardi's true talent was seeing the cracks in the system before anyone else, and knowing exactly how to slip through them. World War II was the greatest thing that ever happened to Carlo Gambino. It didn't just save him from deportation, it made him a millionaire. While American boys were bleeding on foreign soil, Gambino was bleeding the home front dry. The government had created a massive rationing system, an effort to keep the economy and the war machine from collapsing under its own weight. Sugar, meat, coffee, oil, shoes, gasoline. Everything became a commodity regulated by the Office of Price Administration. Every citizen was issued ration books filled with removable stamps. Without them, you couldn't buy a gallon of gas, a pound of beef, or a stick of butter. But in the alleyways and warehouses of New York and New Jersey, ration stamps weren't a patriotic tool. They were currency. And Gambino, who once ruled the bootleg moonshine market during Prohibition, now had a new racket, one that required less firepower and no stills. Just ink, paper, and a system too big to protect itself. He teamed up with his brother Paul and New Jersey's Settimo Big Sam Accardi, a stone-faced racketeer who knew every crooked official between Newark and Camden. At first, they used teams of safecrackers to loot the Office of Price Administration, otherwise known as OPA vaults. But soon, Gambino's crew started buying directly from corrupt government official OPA workers, who stole the stamps from banks and offices after hours. That cut out the risk. No break-ins, no alarms, just envelopes, handshakes, and silence. The business was too good to flood. They were careful, never selling too many stamps to one buyer, keeping prices steady by maintaining artificial scarcity. According to Joe Valachi, Sam himself told me they made over $1 million on one deal alone. I made about $150,000 myself. It wasn't a backroom hustle, it was a wholesale enterprise. A full-scale underground economy that mirrored the one America was pretending to regulate. Gas stations, butchers, grocers, and mechanics all needed stamps to keep their doors open and justify their backdoor sales. The mob didn't need to push. Customers came to them. Valachi didn't jump in right away. He thought it was penny ante stuff. But when a local garage owner waved a fistful of cash in exchange for stamps, Valachi made a call. Within days, he was pushing stamps in bulk, earning thousands for simply passing one envelope to another. No trucks, no guns, no blood, just hustle. Before long, he was working with Frank Luciano, no relation to Lucky, and operating like a wholesaler. He'd get calls from Accardi in Newark. "You got something on hand for me?" "I got some B2s. What's the market?" "8. What'll you charge me?" "For you, Joe, 6. That 2-cent spread on 500,000 gallons made Valachi 10 grand in days. Multiply that by months, he was sitting on over 200,000 in wartime profit. His phone bill hit $100 a month, worth every cent. But Gambino was the real architect. While Valachi moved stamps like a dealer at a craps table, Gambino stayed in the shadows, managing the flow, controlling prices, and laundering his profits into legitimate fronts. He invested in butcher shops, meat rendering plants, bakeries, supermarkets, laundries, nightclubs, dress factories, even labor relations firms. With Accardi managing distribution in New Jersey and Gambino locking down New York, the entire ration system was compromised. Gambino's influence stretched far beyond stamps. He built fruit stands, pizza parlors, garbage routes, and cutlery services, many in the names of relatives like the Castellano brothers or Tom Masotto. He quietly took over the city's garbage disposal, slicing into municipal contracts like they were fresh pork loins. The mob didn't just infiltrate the market, they became the market. Their trucks moved goods, their fronts supplied meat, their union men loaded freight at the ports. They had ties to the mines in Pennsylvania for coal, to the oil fields in Louisiana, and to the steel foundries feeding America's arsenal of democracy. When naval intelligence came sniffing around the docks, Anastasia and Mangano knew it was time to play ball. National security was at stake, and the mob knew the game better than anyone. They didn't just exploit the war, they capitalized on patriotism itself. Luciano, still locked up, would soon be approached by the government to protect the harbors. But even before that deal was inked, the groundwork had been laid. The syndicate didn't wait for Washington's blessing. They were already in business. Even the stamp incineration centers were compromised. Valachi laughed when he remembered it. Those used stamps, supposed to be destroyed, rarely hit the flames. The mob had men inside. They pulled the stamps out and recirculated them. Nothing was wasted. Only the richest dealers could afford to play big. Bulk purchases of stamps could cost $250,000. But if you were mobbed up, you didn't need cash up front. You paid off profits. That's why Luciano brought Valachi in. He had credit, and everyone knew Joe Cargo paid his debts. Sometimes the Cosa Nostra flooded the market, intentionally dumping millions of gallons worth of stamps in a single morning to crash the price and ruin outsiders. One memorable day, 8 million gallons of stamps were unloaded in New York. By nightfall, prices dropped from 9 cents to 2 cents. A lot of guys went belly up. But not Gambino, not Accardi. They had the stamps, they had the streets, and they had the war. Carlo Gambino was flying high in the 1940s. The war had created a black market goldmine, and Gambino, along with Lucchese, Accardi, and the rest of the old crew, was cashing in on ration stamps, meat, gas, and everything else the country couldn't live without. But success doesn't come without shadows. And even kings at the top of the hill still have to watch for falling rocks. One of those rocks came with a name every man in the syndicate already knew. Abe Reles. Gambino was sitting in a quiet corner of the house when the knock came. It wasn't loud, just enough to say, "This is serious." The man behind the door was Tommy Lucchese, his most trusted ally, and Gambino knew it wasn't a social visit. He opened the door, and without a word, Lucchese stepped in. His face was tight, grim. "Is everything okay?" Gambino asked, already knowing the answer. Lucchese didn't hesitate. "Since these bastards got into power, Roosevelt, O'Dwyer, the whole bunch, nothing's been okay. They've been haunting us, chasing us like dogs, and now they've got a snitch." Gambino didn't blink, just sat back, quiet. "A snitch?" he asked finally. Lucchese nodded. "Abe Reles." That name cracked through the room like a bullet. Reles had been a driver for Costello, a killer for Anastasia, a handyman for Murder, Incorporated. He knew everything. Every name, every score, every bloodstain. Gambino leaned forward, his voice low. "This ain't Lepke, it ain't Dutch. Hell, it ain't even Masseria or Maranzano. This guy's surrounded. Agents, notebooks, state cops, federal guys. They've got him locked up tighter than Fort Knox. And every day he's with them. He's spilling his guts onto page after page." Lucchese nodded. "They've got him over at the Tombs. Costello already went to see Luciano up in Dannemora. Gave him the whole picture. O'Dwyer's got him talking, and his boy Turkus is squeezing him day and night. They're running out of ink keeping up. Abe, Kid Twist Reles, had 42 arrests under his belt, and the kind of memory that could put an entire decade of blood under a microscope. He'd worked for Lepke Buchalter, for Albert Anastasia, for Mangano, and for Costello. He'd murdered for hire, operated out of a candy store that sold death by the scoop. Now he was under police protection, hidden away in the Hotel Beaucaire, surrounded by guards, vomiting out years of unsolved murders and long-buried rackets. One of the first to panic was Luciano. From his cell at Dannemora, he whispered through the visitor's screen to Frank Costello. "What are we going to do about it?" "We don't do nothing unless the kid opens his mouth." "He's opening it," Costello said. "Turkus is getting to him and Bill O might not be able to stop it. We gave O'Dwyer everything. Money, muscle. We helped make him DA. But he wants more. He wants LaGuardia's chair. He wants to be a goddamn hero. Luciano didn't sleep that night. His play to get sprung early by Dewey was falling apart. Costello had made contact with Dewey's people, slipped them word that campaign money was waiting. But now, with Reyes singing arias in Brooklyn, that entire plan was unraveling fast. Reyes wasn't named small fry. His memory was an open wound. He gave up Mayone, Abandando, Strauss, Goldstein, Tannenbaum. Names, murders, motives. He linked Anastasia to executions. He pinned Bugsy Siegel, Willie Moretti, even Mangano himself. It was a blood map of Cosa Nostra in America. The most chilling part? The prosecutors didn't even realize at first how far it would go. They just listened and transcribed. 25 notebooks filled in less than 2 weeks. Then came the arrests, the trials, the shockwaves, and the syndicate. They were watching the entire structure bend. Lucchese told Gambino that O'Dwyer had moved Reyes into isolation. Around-the-clock guards, private elevators, secret hotel rooms. "There's no getting to him," Lucchese muttered. "And even if we could, the whole thing's already in ink. The guy's writing our goddamn obituaries." Gambino shook his head. "How the hell did we let this happen? Who took their eyes off him?" Lucchese said nothing. There was no answer. Reyes had been a soldier, a killer. No one saw him as the kind of man who would cut a deal. But he had. And it was too late now. Murder Incorporated, the silent arm of the syndicate, was being laid bare in public. Bodies that had been long buried in rumor were now turning up in sworn testimony, and there was no way to stop it. Not in the courts, not in the press. Only one way. "We've got to find a way to shut him up," Gambino said finally. "We can't survive this, not with him talking." Lucchese didn't argue. He just nodded, and in a hotel window in Brooklyn, under police watch, a canary kept singing. As the noose tightened on Murder Incorporated in the early 1940s, it wasn't just the Brooklyn boys feeling the heat. The reach of Abe Relis's testimony had grown beyond the eastern seaboard, stretching across the country to a place the syndicate had once seen as untouchable, Los Angeles. At the center of it all was a name that burned brighter than most, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. In November 1941, just as Lucky Luciano feared he'd never see freedom again, one particular case sent fresh panic through the underworld. The murder of Harry Big Greenie Greenberg, an old Lepka Buchalter enforcer who'd skipped town in the late 1930s when it became clear the syndicate's internal wars might spill onto his doorstep. Greenberg had fled to Canada, but like most men on the run, he ran out of cash before he ran out of trouble. When he wrote back to New York, hinting that he might make a deal with Tom Dewey in exchange for protection, the mob knew what had to be done. Frankie Carbo got the contract. The job was supposed to be clean, fast, but Greenberg vanished before they could find him. It wasn't until late 1939 that he finally resurfaced in Los Angeles, a city that belonged to Bugsy Siegel. And Siegel, hands-on, hot-tempered, always theatrical, decided to oversee the hit himself. On the night of November 22nd, 1939, Greenberg pulled up in front of a modest house on Vista Del Mar after a short drive to pick up the evening papers. Waiting in a parked car were Siegel, Carbo, and Albert Tannenbaum, the latter having flown in with guns supplied by Longy Zwillman. When Greenberg stepped from the car, Siegel and Carbo moved in. 2 flashes, 2 bullets. Tannenbaum drove them away into the dark. It was meant to vanish like all the others, just another quiet clean-up job in the interest of syndicate security. But it didn't vanish. In 1940, Abe Relis, now singing to Brooklyn prosecutors from the safety of the Hotel Bosseur, told Burton Turkus everything he knew. He hadn't been at the scene, but he'd been in the loop from the start. His corroboration was the final nail. The murder was real. The plot was real. And now the witnesses were real. Turkus flew with Tannenbaum and Relis to California. They testified before a Los Angeles grand jury. Siegel, Carbo, and Champ Siegel were indicted for Greenberg's murder. Lepke and Mendy Weiss were charged for ordering it. But before the warrants could be served, the West Coast lit up with whispers. Siegel and Carbo vanished. Siegel didn't go far. He crawled into the attic of his $200,000 Beverly Hills mansion, hiding above the chandeliers and importing wallpaper like a fugitive prince. Eventually, he surrendered. But he wasn't worried. His jail cell turned into a cocktail lounge. Hollywood stars visited, offering support. He boasted that he'd backed John Dockweiler, the newly elected LA district attorney, with a $30,000 campaign donation. "He's my man," Siegel bragged to Costello. And maybe he was. In early December 1940, Dockweiler asked the court to dismiss the indictment, citing unreliable testimony from a non-key witness. The court agreed. The case evaporated. Siegel walked. But Los Angeles authorities weren't done. They wanted another shot. This time they asked O'Dwyer in New York to send back both Tannenbaum and Relis. O'Dwyer refused. Too risky. He relented only on Tannenbaum. Another indictment followed, but without Relis, without the full narrative, it didn't have the same weight. Siegel vanished again, back to New York, then returned to California, then disappeared altogether. He played it like a gangster film, always 2 steps ahead of the law, ducking indictments, laughing at warrants. But not everyone was laughing. Luciano was furious. Watching from his cell at Dannemora, the walls closing in, he saw the entire empire teetering on the edge. The Lepke trial was in full swing. Murder Incorporated was unraveling. Now Siegel, reckless, flashy Siegel, was attracting more fire than the outfit could handle. He summoned Costello. "This is a derailment," Luciano said. "This ain't just another trial. This could burn the whole thing down. I'm locked up in the middle of goddamn nowhere, and I gotta count on Benny to stay low. That's suicide." Costello tried to reassure him, but even he couldn't lie through it. The truth was ugly. Relis had opened the floodgates, and it wasn't going to stop. And so, behind iron bars and across oceans of distance, the syndicate's original architects watched their empire come under siege. Not from rivals, but from ghosts. Dead men. Silent men. And one man who wouldn't stop talking. By late 1941, Lucky Luciano had grown tired of hearing about Benny Siegel's power plays in Los Angeles and Albert Anastasia's impulsive vendettas in Brooklyn. What ate at him most was that they were still walking around, drinking wine, eating steak, living like kings, while he sat locked up in Dannemora, a forgotten king in a concrete box. But times were shifting. Dr. Walter Martin, the new warden, had replaced the hard-nosed William Snyder. Martin didn't see Luciano as the devil Dewey made him out to be. He thought the sentence was excessive, political theatre. So he started granting small privileges, better food, cleaner quarters, and more importantly, private meetings with visitors. When Frank Costello came to see him, Luciano wasted no time. "Frank, I'm sick and tired of all the shit between Benny and Albert. They got the heat on them and they're still walking free. Meanwhile, I'm rotting here. We gave O'Dwyer a piss pot full of money. What the hell are we getting for it?" Costello didn't sugarcoat it. "Charlie, I've tried. O'Dwyer's got stars in his eyes. He don't want to wait. He wants Washington. It wants to be the next Dewey, but bigger. I told him we'd hand him the mayor's job, push LaGuardia out. But the son of a bitch won't listen anymore." Luciano leaned in. "What the hell's he is doing for us then?" "Nothing," Costello said. "That's the truth." Luciano's eyes narrowed. He slammed his palm on the table. Then what the fuck are we doing about Reles? That name, Abe Reles, the canary who could sing but couldn't fly, hung in the air like poison. Reles was tying Anastasia directly to the murder of Morris Moish Diamond, a Teamsters official who'd resisted the mob's encroachment into union control and threatened to talk to Dewey. That threat bought him 6 bullets in the head on a Brooklyn street in May of 1939. Ali Tannenbaum had driven the hit. Anastasia had overseen it. Now both were exposed. Luciano was livid. I warned Albert not to go around hitting guys unless it was someone from the outfit. You kill somebody outside, you're begging for trouble. He didn't have to hit Diamond. I sent him the fucking word, knock it off. But Anastasia had done it anyway, and now Reles was talking. Frank, Luciano said, Reles has got to go. That's the only way to save Benny and Albert. Without him, I don't care how loud O'Dwyer or Dewey scream. They ain't convicting nobody. Costello had come prepared. That's one of the reasons I'm here. We got something lined up. Reles is stashed away like Fort Knox. Cops on him 24 hours, even when he sleeps. Luciano waved it off. We've been greasing Brooklyn cops for years. You're telling me we can't reach one little rat? Only way is to let the cops do it themselves. So let 'em. Let 'em earn their fucking money. It's gonna cost, Charlie. I don't give a fuck what it costs. Pay it. Costello nodded. That's what he came for. The green light. Luciano gave it. And when you're sure it's locked up, tell Benny to give himself up. Let him play the martyr. A month later, Siegel surrendered to Los Angeles authorities. Again. No surprise. Luciano knew what that meant. The deal was done. On November 12, 1941, Abe Reles, star witness in the state's crusade against murder, Inc., fell to his death from a 6th-floor window at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. He was in protective custody. 5 cops were outside his room. Not one saw a thing. Luciano never forgot the date. That was a turning point, he told his lawyer years later, because if we couldn't shut Reles up, the whole house was coming down. There was a name behind it. Captain Frank Bowles, a top investigator under O'Dwyer and one of the most powerful cops in the city. He and O'Dwyer were tight. Like 2 fingers on the same hand, Luciano said. And it was Bowles who arranged for Reles to take that final flight. No wings, no screams. Just a silent plummet into the cold, Coney Island dawn. And just like that, the canary stopped singing. On the cold morning of November 12th, 1941, Abe Kid Twist Reles was exactly where the state of New York had chained him. Room 623, Half Moon Hotel, Coney Island. The door was open, as usual, and as usual, he was supposed to be under round-the-clock guard. Assigned to protect him were 5 officers. Detectives James Boyle, Victor Robbins, John Moran, and patrolmen Francesco Tempone and Harvey McLaughlin. All of them were under the command of Captain Frank Bowles, O'Dwyer's personal fixer, and Sergeant Elwood Divers. There was said to be a 6th man on that shift. No one could agree on who. Some said he never showed up. Others said he vanished before the body hit the roof. Sometime before 7 in the morning, the hotel's assistant manager heard a thud on the extension roof just below Reles's window. He ignored it. Minutes later, Robbins claimed he checked in on the canary, said Reles was tucked in bed. But by 7:10, when Robbins peeked again, the bed was empty. Reles was gone. Outside the window, 42 feet below, lay the body of the most important informant ever produced by Brooklyn prosecutors. Next to him were 2 knotted bedsheets. His body had landed more than 20 feet away from the wall. It was, Captain Bowles would later say, an unfortunate accident. Within hours, Bowles, who was of course now investigating his own men, concluded there was nothing suspicious. According to Bowles, Reyes had tried to escape using bedsheets and slipped. Or maybe, Bowles mused, he was pulling one of his famous pranks, climbing out the window to sneak back in and startle his guards, and lost his grip. Other officials suggested suicide, claiming Reyes had suddenly been overcome by guilt. But those who knew the game and the players saw something else. He was sleeping, Luciano said years later, and one of those cops gave him a tap with a billy, knocked him cold. Then they picked him up and tossed him out the fucking window. The way Luciano heard it, Bowles supervised the whole thing. The payoff? 50 grand, cash. And more money was stashed aside for the others, in case they had to take the fall. They never did. For the 5 patrolmen, the punishment was barely a slap. They were put back in uniform and assigned to foot patrol. Bals and divers. Not only untouched, but rewarded. When William O'Dwyer became mayor of New York City in 1945, he promoted Captain Frank Bowles to Deputy Police Commissioner. He became our bagman for the whole department, Luciano recalled. He gotten grand in small bills in the same goddamn paper bag every week, like fucking clockwork. The dough went to Bowles. He split it. That was the setup. And with that, Abe Reyes was gone. So was the state's perfect case against Albert Anastasia for the murder of Moish Diamond, a case O'Dwyer had once paraded like a prize bull. But behind the curtain, it was already a fraud. During the 19 months between Reyes's confession and his death, when Anastasia had supposedly gone underground and O'Dwyer claimed to be scouring the country for him, no indictment was ever filed. In fact, O'Dwyer personally forbade his team from seeking one, even though Assistant DA Burton Turkus would later say O'Dwyer knew damn well Anastasia had to approve every Brooklyn contract killing. The excuse? He's a fugitive. What's the point of indicting him if we can't find him? Before shipping off to join the army and return a brigadier general, O'Dwyer handed the case to Bowles, who quietly filed a final memo. In the case of Anastasio, corroboration is missing. The death of Abe Reyes deprived the state of testimony and information. Only accomplice testimony remains. In 1945, a Brooklyn grand jury condemned O'Dwyer's handling as negligence, incompetence, and flagrant irresponsibility. They said he had competent legal evidence of Anastasia's guilt and sat on it. They called his failure to indict or prosecute revolting. But it didn't matter. The machine moved on. Tammany Hall backed O'Dwyer's 1945 mayoral bid anyway, and then again in 1949. The money kept flowing. The bag kept getting passed, and the body of Abe Reyes was filed away in the coldest of cases. Meanwhile, Albert Anastasia, the butcher of the Brooklyn docks, returned from hiding like Caesar crossing the Rubicon, untouchable and smirking. And in the shadows, Carlo Gambino kept his hands clean. He had no need for showmanship. Let Anastasia take the heat. Let Siegel make headlines. Gambino kept the books, moved the stamps, and waited. Because while the bosses were busy killing each other's witnesses, Carlo was building the future, one silent, bloodless step at a time. Albert Anastasia owed everything to Charlie Luciano. It wasn't just respect, it bordered on obsession. Luciano was the kingmaker, the one man Anastasia admired above all others. And when Luciano went to prison, Anastasia didn't just send thoughts and prayers. He started planning payback. The docks were Anastasia's kingdom. He knew every crate, every foreman, every whisper of movement that flowed through the ports. When rumors started to circulate, federal agents nosing around about sabotage, Nazi sympathizers, dock safety, Anastasia knew what to do. The Sicilians from Buffalo and Pennsylvania were already on edge, and Anastasia moved to unite them, smoothing things over, tightening loyalties. He extended quiet feelers to naval intelligence, and they reached back, Through Anastasia, organized crime started feeding the government information. Doc rats, who were asking the wrong questions. Crew members with suspicious political leanings. Cargo manifests that didn't add up. Then came Pearl Harbor, and the country lurched into war. A man like Anastasia, with a record that could make the devil blush, should have been the last person Uncle Sam wanted in uniform. But the game had changed. The ports were vital, and the military needed muscle that knew how to move goods without delays or leaks. Anastasia didn't flinch when the draft came. In fact, he welcomed it. A technical sergeant's uniform came with cover, clout, and a straight path to citizenship. For 2 years he trained soldiers how to handle the docks, how to move crates, watch for sabotage, sniff out trouble before it started. It was his world, and now it was legitimate. When he was discharged in 1944, it was with honor, and with papers making him a citizen of the very country that had once tried to deport him. Others were cashing in too. Herbert Lehman left Albany for the war effort. Thomas Dewey, riding high off his mob-busting fame, stepped into the governor's seat. And in his cell, up in Dannemora, Charles Luciano quietly pulled the strings of a master plan that stretched from Sing Sing to Sicily, from ration stamps to Havana. Behind him were men like Carlo Gambino, still low profile but deadly efficient, and Settimo Accardi, knee-deep in stolen gasoline, black market meat, and wartime fraud, with Anastasia winning favor through patriotism and Gambino working the stamps and supply lines with Marcello, Trafficante, Adonis, Mangano brothers, Anastasia, Lucchese, and Tom Galliano Profaci, Longhi Zwilman, Willie Moretti, John Scalish outfit, Stefano Magadino, Russell Bufalino, Maya Lansky, Jimmy Blue Eyes, the Levine Connection, and a whole lot more. The Mafia wasn't just surviving the war, it was thriving in it. When Tommy Lucchese came to visit Carlo Gambino, there was a shadow on his face that said everything. He didn't have to explain. Gambino already knew. It was all over the papers. The underworld had been buzzing about it for days. Abe, Kid Twist Reles, the canary who sang but couldn't fly, had taken a dive from a 6th-story window at the Half Moon Hotel. Gambino, stunned, looked at Tommy and asked quietly, "How the hell did they do it?" Lucchese leaned in, his voice cold and casual. "Money talks, my friend." Gambino didn't flinch. He smiled, nodding. "I figured it was a bribe. I'm not asking how much. I'm asking how." Tommy laid it out piece by piece. The cops who were supposed to guard Reles bought and paid for. Not beat cops. These were orders from higher up. Captain Frank Bowles and his crew were in on it. They made Reles drink heavy, slipped him something to make sure he stayed under. While he slept, one of the boys cracked him over the head with a billy club. Not enough to draw blood, but enough to keep him out cold. Then, without a word, they picked him up and launched him out the window. That's why there was no scream, just a thud when his body hit the roof. No witnesses, no sound, no panic, just silence. And in that silence, something clicked for Gambino. From that day forward, he understood that the police weren't peacekeepers anymore. They were soldiers, just wearing a different uniform. The badge was a formality. They served power, not the people, and that power now belonged to men like him. Law enforcement, from the beat cop in Brooklyn to the commissioner in Manhattan, had been swallowed whole by organized crime. $10,000 a week was the going rate to keep eyes shut and mouths closed. Narcotics, prostitution, gambling. Cops weren't just looking the other way. They were in on the action. They were taking their cut. And it didn't stop there. Federal agents, district attorneys, even the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover, the man who publicly denied the Mafia existed, was tight with Costello and Lansky's people. District attorneys were dining with mob bosses. Union leaders depended on Mafia protection. Journalists took bribes or vanished. And if a local racketeer in Harlem or Brooklyn stood in the way, his operation was turned over to the Italians, hand-delivered by the same cops who were supposed to protect the city. Gambino saw the whole thing for what it was, a takeover. The city didn't belong to the government anymore. It belonged to men in silk suits who played cards with cops and gave orders like generals. Good cops? There were a few, but they didn't stand a chance. Narcotics wiped that out in the 1950s and 1960s. New York turned into a death factory. No safety, no law, no escape. If you were poor, if you were black, if you were vulnerable, you were prey. And the predators wore uniforms. Movies like Serpico would one day show this cancer. But back then, no one dared speak it aloud. Because it wasn't just corruption, it was organized, and it was absolute. Lucchese didn't sugarcoat it. He told Gambino straight, even with Luciano behind bars, we control Hoover. We control the cops. Some of them are made. We got cops doing hits. We own the docks. We own the unions. We own the press. Nothing moves unless we say so. And Gambino understood. He understood that ruling the Mafia didn't just mean running crews or calling shots. It meant understanding the system. You had to know how to rule the rulers. But what Gambino didn't yet know was that Luciano's days in New York were already numbered. While Anastasia was pulling every string to get him out, Governor Tom Dewey was making sure Luciano would never return. In the next chapter, the game shifts again into war. We'll explore the Mafia's deepening ties with naval intelligence and the Office of Strategic Services, the planning behind the invasion of Sicily, and the fateful meetings that led to Luciano's release. And we'll see how Gambino helped build a transatlantic empire by appointing his own people to run the Sicilian wing of La Cosa Nostra. When Lepka went flying out that hotel window, whatever remained of the old Murder Incorporated went with him. The days of gathering loose-lipped killers under one roof, mixing gangsters, rackets, drugs, payroll records and blood all in the same building. That was over. It was like gift-wrapping a criminal empire and handing it straight to Uncle Sam. The game had changed. Murder had to evolve, and Carlo Gambino knew it. He wasn't about to let a single crew of glory hounds bring down the whole structure. From here on out, the killing would be done differently, calculated, compartmentalized, deniable. Gambino leaned into his roots. He began to rely on Sicilian muscle, killers brought in from Palermo, men with no names and no paper trail. He looked to trusted allies like Frank Scalise, who had his own army of quiet professionals, dead-eyed soldiers who knew how to disappear. The strategy was simple. Take young men off the streets, mold them, break them in. Some were groomed to one day be made men, but not before they earned their bones. Others were kept outside the family, used only as contractors. Italian, Jewish, Irish, it didn't matter. If they could pull the trigger and keep their mouth shut, they got paid. No names, no reasons, just a photograph and a date. The sensitive hits, the ones that couldn't be traced, were handled by recruits within the Italian syndicates. They didn't know who signed the contract or why. They were told only what mattered: the target, the time, the location. A stranger would pick them up. Another would hand them a gun. The car they drove had never been seen before, and wouldn't be seen again. Backup vehicles waited nearby in case police got too close. If needed, those decoys would ram the cops, take the heat, misdemeanor charges at most, while the real shooter vanished into the wind. After the job, the weapon was ditched, the car crushed. The hitter and the driver? They never met again. Sometimes they never even exchanged a word. This was the new face of murder in the syndicate, clinical, clean, and designed to leave no trail. After the war, it got even easier. The men coming back from Europe had learned everything they needed: how to handle a rifle, how to stalk a target, how to kill without flinching. Some were trained in sabotage, some in torture. All of them knew how to follow orders and disappear afterward. And sometimes the killer was someone close. Your best friend, the guy you watched the game with last Sunday. He'd greet you with a smile, a slap on the back, maybe even pick up the tab. Then he'd follow behind you as you opened a door, and just like that, 2 shots to the back of the head. No hesitation, no emotion, just muscle memory. The body would vanish, burned, buried, dumped at sea. 100 different ways, all tested, all proven. Gambino didn't need another Murder Incorporated. He needed killers he could trust, soldiers who were quiet, loyal, and efficient. And that's exactly who he surrounded himself with. Gambino was beginning to understand the truth about the world he was buried in. Corruption wasn't just part of the game, it was the game. It was everywhere. And then Lucchese, calm as ever, dropped a bomb on him. Luciano might have a way out of prison. Gambino was stunned. He'd heard whispers, felt the quiet shifting of influence. But this was different. This was movement. And it wasn't just because of the war breaking out in Europe. It was something deeper. Luciano wasn't betting on chance. He was betting on politics. He understood it better than most mobsters because he'd studied it like a soldier studies his enemy. He knew Tom Dewey didn't just want scalps. He wanted office. He wanted power. And he had powerful men backing him. Men tied to the Office of Strategic Services. Now those same men were reaching out. They wanted Dewey to have a relationship with Luciano's crew, especially Albert Anastasia and the unions that ran the docks. The thinking was simple. If America was going to win this war, they needed the ports. And the ports belonged to the mob. In the 1940s, a quiet alliance began to take shape. Naval intelligence and organized crime. 2 enemies, now business partners. Lucchese told Gambino the details, the approaches to Dewey, the deals being floated. Gambino already knew Dewey had accepted help in the Lepka case. He also knew Dewey was fully aware that Luciano had handed Lepka over. If Dewey could swallow that, he could swallow anything, even a bribe, even the help of men like Luciano. After all, the men who fought corruption rarely made it to office. The establishment didn't trust them. They knew a man who took on rackets might one day take on them. So Dewey needed the mob, just like the mob needed him. If Luciano and his people could help get Dewey elected governor and maybe later into the White House, then doors would open. Deals would be made. And Gambino. He was watching it all. Watching the same men who sent Luciano upstate now prepare to shake his hand. That's when he learned what politics in America really was. Hypocrisy, dressed in a suit. In Sicily, hypocrites were hated more than thieves. In America, they were elected. It wasn't just the FBI. It wasn't just the Office of Naval Intelligence. It wasn't just the OSS. It was the whole goddamn country, using the Mafia for whatever suited them. And the Mafia, in return, profited from it, quietly and effectively. Luciano later recalled it himself. I've read 1,000,000 stories about me and Dewey, and how I got paroled, and all of them are so much horseshit. The idea started in 1940, when I gave Mo Polikoff the note for Lansky about backing Dewey for governor. And it kind of grew from there, until everything fell into place. The first major move came at the end of 1940. Luciano was in his cell at Dannemora when the guards told him he had a visitor, not in the visitor's room, but in the prison doctor's office. That was enough to make any man nervous. He walked in. The warden left. A moment later, the door opened, and in walked Judge McCook, the same judge who'd given him 50 years. Only now, McCook looked like he'd aged 50 himself. Luciano didn't say a word. He let the man talk. And McCook broke down right there. He cried. He begged. He rambled about being a good Christian, about going to church every Sunday, about never meaning to hurt anybody. Then he dropped the reason for his visit. He thought Luciano had cursed him. "I didn't know what the fuck to say," Luciano said later. He gets on his knees, crawls over to me, grabs my hand, starts slobbering all over it, calling me Mr. Luciano, and begging me to take the curse off him. I just sat there watching him fall apart. McCook's life had unraveled. His house burned down, his wife and child dead, and one misfortune after another ever since he'd sentenced Luciano. Now, he wanted forgiveness. And Luciano, ever the tactician, gave it. He told the judge not to worry, that he'd take care of it, and that maybe one day McCook could do something for him. Nothing illegal, nothing shady, just something helpful. In that moment, Luciano knew. He had McCook in his pocket. Justice, he figured, had come. 4 years late, but still. By 1943, when Luciano filed for parole, it was McCook, now a justice on the New York State Supreme Court, who heard the arguments. He didn't free him, not yet, but he left the door open. If Luciano continues to cooperate and remains a model prisoner, McCook said, it may be appropriate at some future time to apply for executive clemency. But timing was everything. The witnesses, Reyes, Tannenbaum, they were still talking. The public still had blood on their mind. So Luciano waited. He knew when the heat died down, his time would come. And then it did. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt declared war. The world turned upside down. And nobody cared about gangsters anymore. That's when Luciano made his second move. He summoned Mo Polikoff, told him to bring Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky up to Dannemora. In the visitors' room, Luciano laid it out. "I told them it had more twists and turns than a pretzel," he said. "But I knew it would work if we played it right." The key? Dewey. The man who got famous putting Luciano away was now their best bet to get him out, and Dewey wanted to be governor in 1942. Luciano had thought it over. Dewey was no better than him, he figured, just a gangster with a law degree. The way he'd framed Luciano proved it, and anyone who could play that dirty, Luciano believed, could be bought, if the deal was sweet enough. Costello already had a go-between lined up. That part was ready. Luciano wanted Polikoff to go after the witnesses, again. This time, he wanted airtight affidavits. He wanted them to say Dewey had coached them, paid them, and built the whole frame. The goal wasn't a new trial. It was leverage. Lansky pushed back, said they'd already tried that, paid a fortune. McCook didn't buy it. That's when Luciano told them about McCook's visit. Costello's jaw dropped. Lansky stared, silent. Polikoff was furious. If he'd known earlier, it could have saved them years. But Luciano explained, the timing hadn't been right back then. Now it was. Costello raised a question. What if Dewey don't make it to Albany? Luciano looked to Lansky. What are the odds? Lansky didn't blink. 5-1 he wins, easy. With our help he walks in. Without it, he's just another guy with headlines. Polikoff asked the real question. You think Dewey's going to risk his future just to let you out? He'd be impeached. Luciano nodded. He had already thought of that. Dewey needed an excuse, something clean, something patriotic, and that's where Sicily came in. Luciano pulled out a letter from Vito Genovese, written from Rome before the war broke out. Vito had been living well, making connections, including Mussolini himself. But what mattered more was what Vito wrote. In Sicily, Luciano was treated like a king. His name carried real weight. Luciano put it together. He pointed to a newspaper story about German U-boats, spies, sabotage on the waterfront. "Zip your lip," it said in bold print. Fear was everywhere. That's when Lansky caught on. "Charlie," he said, "I get it." "It's terrific. How can Dewey turn down a patriotic hero?" Costello nodded. "We got people in the Navy. Church Street's covered. We can pass the word." Luciano told them to start working. 2 things needed to happen fast. They had to spark a real need for Mafia help on the docks. And they had to lock up the witnesses, signed, sealed, delivered. He had one more card to play, but he held it close. He'd wait for the perfect moment. For a month, he waited, nervous, impatient. He fought with guys in the yard, pushed away visitors. His nerves were shot, but in the silence, in the waiting, he could feel it. The tide was turning.